Subcommittee will come to order. The chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. Today, this subcommittee will examine implementation of the Environmental Protection Agency's Brownfields grant program. Brownfields are generally described as properties that contain or may contain a hazardous substance, pollutant, or contaminant, which in turn complicates efforts to expand, redevelop, or reuse the site. Often these contaminated sites are not redeveloped because prospective new owners are worried about becoming responsible for potential liability as the original company that is liable for the contamination no longer exists. Through this program, EPA provides grant funding to states, tribes, economic development agencies, and other entities who are then able to study the extent of contamination, clean up the site, and find a way to redevelop it. Since 1993, EPA has administered efforts to clean up these sites. Congress first formally established the Brownfields program in the Small Business Liability Relief and Brownfields Revitalization Act of 2002 and codified it under the Comprehensive Environment Response, Compensation, and Liability Act. The Brownfields program has traditionally enjoyed bipartisan support, and the last statutory authorization expired last September at the end of fiscal year 2023. Reauthorizing this program will provide us with an opportunity to examine the program and find out what aspects are working well and what aspects need improvement. I believe taking testimony from our witnesses today will help us to inform our efforts. Additionally, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act provided an unprecedented supplemental appropriation of $1.5 billion for brownfields. The awards funded under the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act were exempted from some of the traditional statutory limitations, such as certain maximum grant amounts and state and local cost share requirements. We will need to examine these changes and understand their advantages and their disadvantages. EPA estimates there are more than 450,000 brownfield properties in the United States. This amounts to a lot of unused or underutilized land with great economic potential. Broadly, we also know that we will need additional infrastructure and facilities to support our growing economy and process the materials and components needed for new, innovative technologies. The Brownfields program may also be a good tool to help secure American leadership in emerging industries and traditional manufacturing. For example, ABI Research, an industry analysis firm, estimates that by the end of 2025, there will be over 6,000 data centers built worldwide as artificial intelligence continues to take off. Over the next 5 years, our country's electricity demand is expected to grow by 16%. This growing demand will entail construction of additional energy resources. So today we will examine opportunities to bring those industries to brownfield sites in our communities and explore existing barriers to put these sites to good use. In my district in Southwest Virginia, counties, state agencies, regional organizations, and public-private partnerships have already been hard at work revitalizing former mine land for economic development. I hope we can learn more today about how the Brownfields program can support these endeavors and similar ones around the country. Thanks to our witnesses for being here and contributing to these efforts. First, we have the Honorable Jim Connaughton, Chief Executive Officer of James L. Connaughton Strategies, where he works on sustainable technology, innovation, and public policy. Mr. Connaughton recently served as CEO of Nautilus Data Technologies, a company producing data center components with minimal environmental impacts. He also served as chairman of the White House Council on Environmental Quality under President Bush. As you all know, this committee has been engaged in robust discussion over the past few years on ways to improve permitting process generally, so we welcome his extensive experience in this area. We also welcome back Mayor Christian Ballwidge. Did I get that right? All right. From the city of Elizabeth, New Jersey, the committee greatly appreciates him lending his knowledge and expertise to our efforts to reauthorize the Brownfields program. We will also hear from Krista Stoneham, President and CEO of the Houston Land Bank. Thank you for being here today and sharing your insights on the program and efforts to revitalize the areas your organization serves. Last but not least, I'm excited to recognize and to welcome my constituent, Dwayne Miller, Executive Director of Lennowisco Planning District Commission. And if you want the definition of what that is, we'll give it to you later. But my staff and I have had the privilege of working with the commission for years. They've played an integral role in attracting emerging industries to our region, creating jobs, and cleaning up abandoned sites in Southwest Virginia. Thank you all for being here, and I look forward to a good discussion today. And I now recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Tonko, for his opening statement.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. EPA's Brownfields program has enjoyed tremendous bipartisan support for decades. And I do hope we can continue to work together to examine and strengthen the program in the 119th Congress. I'm certain we all share a love for the places we have the privilege of representing. And like so many districts across the country, New York's 20th has an incredible manufacturing history that is foundational to its story. Along the Mohawk and Hudson Rivers, many mill towns once thrived. Factories produced carpets and collars and leather products, to name just a few. But sadly, many of these sites have closed, leaving valuable properties, often on the waterfront, abandoned or underutilized. And this, too, is part of my district's history. But the story of these former industrial communities does not need to end here, with blighted properties and years of disinvestment. EPA's Brownfields program can be the catalyst for these communities' comebacks by creating new economic opportunities that begin with assessing and remediating former industrial sites. In my district, Brownfields funding has led to transformational revitalizations. Some sites have become new parks, allowing public access to the waterfront. Others have been prepared for redevelopment, enabling new employers to move in. And simply put, these success stories would not be possible without EPA's programs. Since 2002, tens of thousands of acres of idle land have been made ready for productive use, increasing property values and local tax revenue, preserving greenfields and creating jobs. We know EPA's program has a proven track record of success and provides effective down payments. Each dollar spent leverages more than $20. And I am incredibly proud that the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act included an historic investment of some $1.5 billion for the program for fiscal years 2022 through 2026. These funds included $1.2 billion for the EPA's program and $300 million for state programs. IIJA also took important steps to create greater opportunities for disadvantaged communities by waiving the program's cost share requirements and increasing the maximum award amounts. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses whether the IIJA has been effective and how Congress best build upon those investments. Finally, I want to express my concerns at the Trump administration's suggestion that 65% of EPA's budget could be cut. The majority of EPA's funding goes to programs that state and local governments rely upon. Without a doubt, a cut of this magnitude will have devastating consequences for our districts. And I do hope Congress will ensure that the value of EPA's programs, including the Brownfields program, are properly reflected in our appropriations process as it moves forward. Because the Brownfields program is an incredible investment of federal dollars, it enables local governments to support environmental and economic revitalization by turning a liability into an opportunity. I hope we can work together to make certain this program has the resources and the authorities necessary to continue its great work. With that, I would like to yield my remaining time to our colleague and good friend, Congressman Menendez, and thank you.
Thank you, Ranking Member Tonko. I'm honored to welcome Mayor Bolich to the Energy and Commerce Committee today to discuss the incredible work being done on brownfields across the country and back home in New Jersey's 8th Congressional District. Mayor Bolich was first elected as mayor of Elizabeth in 1992 and has prioritized the redevelopment of brownfield sites throughout his tenure. He's been recognized for his role in redeveloping brownfields and was awarded the Distinguished Leadership Award for elected officials by the American Plan Association. He is testifying today in his capacity as chair of the U.S. Conference of Mayors Brownfields Task Force, a role that he has held for over 20 years. Mayor Bolich is uniquely qualified to discuss the importance of reauthorizing the federal Brownfields program and has testified at every Brownfields hearing this committee has had. It's an honor to call Mayor Bolich a friend and partner and to recognize the success stories in Elizabeth that he has overseen. Mayor Bolich, thank you for your leadership on this issue. I look forward to hearing your testimony here today. That I yield back.
Gentlemen, yield back. Now recognize the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Guthrie, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Griffith, and Ranking Member Pallone, and Ranking Member Tonko, my colleagues, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. Today we'll be examining implementation of EPA's Brownfields program and opportunities to carry on bipartisan tradition of reauthorizing the program. As you all know, brownfields are contaminated sites or areas that are suspected of being contaminated The negative impact of Brownfield site does not end within the geographic boundary of the site itself. They can also pose environmental hazards beyond their borders and lead to broader economic downturns in their communities, and unfortunately, brownfields are found nationwide. Legal liability for existing contamination often discourages buyers from purchasing properties for redevelopment out of fear of litigation. Properties then sit vacant as communities lose the opportunity to improve their local economy. We have a mandate to ensure taxpayer dollars are spent wisely. And part of why we are here today is to look at how we can improve upon this program moving forward and redevelop brownfield sites to support new and emerging industries, potentially even including opportunities to build a state-of-the-art AI data centers. The Brownfields program has been successful in aiding economic development while prioritizing environmental contamination. Just look at my home state of Kentucky. The Commonwealth of Kentucky and the historic Fayette County Courthouse in Lexington was used for over 100 years before the courts transitioned to a bigger facility. Shortly after becoming vacant, workers discovered structural defects, water damage, high levels of lead paint, asbestos, and other hazardous materials. The public-private partnership between the developer and the EPA through the Brownfields program made its revitalization possible. This building now houses a restaurant, visitor center, event space, and is a focal point for the community while maintaining historical integrity. You have major sites like the Hudson Yards in New York City, which is built on a Long Island Railroad yard. When completed, Hudson Yards is expected to contribute $19 billion per year to the local economy. And I went to school just up the Palisades Parkway from Elizabeth, and so I consider northern New Jersey, Manhattan, my college town. And my daughter went to intern a couple summers ago in New York City, and I saw the address. She was in a college dorm, and it was near Hudson Yards, adjacent. But I didn't know that it really existed till I moved her in, and I know the difference between what it was and what it is. So I was concerned when I saw the neighborhood she was moving into till I got there, and just saw how beautiful and nice it was. And absolutely, northern New Jersey is just absolutely fantastic as well. And so we have other brownfield sites across the country I know that we're going to talk about today. One in Indianapolis was a vacant 19th century iron foundry, and it was given a second chance to make affordable housing. This program also helps us in our mission to expand nuclear power and restore American energy dominance. In the 118th Congress, I was proud to see my bill, the Nuclear for Brownfield Sites Preparation Act, signed into law as part of the ADVANCE Act. My bill utilizes existing infrastructure to lower project costs and further our investments in nuclear power by allowing nuclear facilities at brownfield sites. The Brownfields program has been a bipartisan tradition here at Energy and Commerce Committee, and this hearing today upholds that legacy. I really appreciate our witnesses for being here. Look forward to hear what's going on in your communities, and I look forward to the further discussion. And Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes of an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me thank all of the panel, but I particularly want to thank Mayor Chris Baldridge, who's, as you know, the chair of the I guess his official title is Chair, U.S. Conference of Mayors Brownfields Task Force. But I think that kind of, underplays the role that you've played for so many years in our Brownfields program from the very beginning. And I know you've been a trusted advisor to me on everything we do at Brownfields. So thank you for all that and for being here today. We're discussing the Brownfields program, which continues to be a shining example of how government can protect the public health of our communities while also stimulating economic growth. In 2002, I partnered with the late Representative Paul Gilmore of Ohio, who chaired this subcommittee at the time, to write the Brownfields law. And over the last 20 years, the Brownfields program has consistently enjoyed bipartisan support and has been an economic engine for local government and communities looking to turn former contaminated sites into economic centers and green spaces. And every congressional district is home to at least one of these sites. As part of the program, the federal government provides financial help in the form of grants or loans for cleanup, assessments, and job training so communities can turn impacted sites into parks, public housing, or new business centers. And since its inception, more than 40,000 sites have been revitalized and made ready for development around the nation. And these revitalization projects leverage nearly 280,000 jobs and more than $41 billion in economic development. So this funding really has been a lifeline for communities, and with the passage of the bipartisan infrastructure law in 2021, we were able to inject an additional $1.5 billion into the Brownfields program, and that increased annual awards by nearly 400% to around $240 million. Through these funds, communities are growing their economies for the future and creating good-paying jobs. And the Brownfields program also benefits public health and safety by reducing contamination in communities that couldn't afford to repurpose contaminated sites on their own. And that's just the beginning. For every dollar the federal government invests in the Brownfields program, we get more than $20 back in economic return, and that showcases the win-win scenario that the program facilitates. And it's important that we keep all of these benefits in mind as we look to reauthorize the program before funding runs out in fiscal year 2026. We must reauthorize and fund the program to continue its critical mission, and I believe that starting these bipartisan conversations early, Mr. Chairman, is the necessary first step. I hope we can all agree that this program is more than worth every dollar we put into it, and that we can work together to provide robust funding moving forward. But what makes today's hearing unique is the chaotic circumstances in which we find ourselves. The Trump administration, perpetrated by Elon Musk and Doge, has continued to recklessly and, I believe, illegally cut staff at federal agencies, including those that administer the Brownfields program at the EPA's Office of Land and Emergency Management. These illegal funding freezes have directly impacted the Brownfields program, delaying projects and causing confusion among grant recipients who are responsible for cleaning up these sites. The Brownfields program protects our communities and revitalizes our local economies, and we owe it to all of our constituents to figure out a path forward, ensuring funding is delivered. It's crucial that any discussion of the future of the Brownfields program builds on the program's economic and community success while recognizing the need for dedicated federal staff to administer it. So I thank you again, Mr. Chairman, and with that I yield back.
Gentleman yields back, and I appreciate that. We now conclude with member opening statements. The chair would like to remind members that pursuant to the committee rules, all members' opening statements will be made a part of the record. We want to thank our witnesses for taking the time to testify before the subcommittee. Although it is not the practice of this subcommittee to swear in witnesses, I would remind our witnesses that knowingly and willfully making material false statements to the legislative branch is against the law under Title 18, Section 1001 of the United States Code. You will have an opportunity to give an opening statement, followed by questions from members. That said, we will now begin our opening statements, and our first witness will be Mr. Connaughton. You are recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Griffith, Ranking Member Tonko, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Jim Connaughton. I am a technology entrepreneur, a policy entrepreneur, and an innovation infrastructure developer. I have spent the better part of my professional life in and around brownfields, and I was privileged to be with Mayor Bolwich at the signing of the Brownfields Act in 2001 in Conshohocken, Pennsylvania. Growing our economy to meet the needs of a thriving population and national security will require a doubling or even a tripling of infrastructure over the next 25 years. That means hundreds of thousands of new projects. The hundreds of thousands of America's brownfields are the best place to start driving innovation, unleashing prosperity, and revitalizing our communities. My written testimony highlights 5 priority areas of American industrial innovation where brownfields are ideal: data centers, semiconductor manufacturing, submarine and shipbuilding, energy production, and plastics recycling. During Q&A, I hope to be able to talk about my own successful, albeit challenging, 8-year saga developing innovative AI data center infrastructure at 2 brownfields in the state of California, and many others. My testimony today, however, is going to focus on the critical barriers to success of brownfield projects: the prolonged delays in approving site assessments, environmental permits, and connections to the electricity grid. These delays either kill brownfield projects or needlessly make them 2 to 3 times more expensive than they need to be. Whether your objective is growing the economy, sustaining U.S. technology leadership, strengthening national security, addressing the energy emergency, or confronting climate change, fully achieving these objectives is procedurally impossible. I will highlight 4 policies to enable immediate and lower-cost project development. These policies eliminate process and litigation barriers while preserving compliance with our nation's environmental protection laws. The first speed bump for projects happens when agencies delay signing off on the environmental site assessments used to clear brownfield sites for reuse. This work is now performed quickly and cost-effectively by credentialed private sector experts using well-established methods developed over 30 years and tens of thousands of projects. Congress should authorize an automatic sign-off process for certified third-party expert site assessments. The second major delay happens during environmental permitting. I'm recommending that Congress legislate a permit-by-rule approach that I call approve, build, and comply, or ABC. The legislation would categorically approve a list of pre-cleared locations and pre-cleared types of critical infrastructure projects in lieu of further permitting. Such projects would still have to comply with substantive environmental regulations, and any noncompliance would still remain subject to enforcement. These pre-cleared locations would include areas that federal, state, and tribal law have already prioritized, such as brownfields, opportunity zones, energy communities, shipyards, and existing rights-of-way. The third delay factor, of course, is NEPA and its state equivalents. The solution is to refocus NEPA reviews on unquantified environmental impacts as the original 1970 law provides. Since 1970, hundreds of federal, state, local, and tribal laws have been enacted, all of which quantify most every environmental impact in thousands of implementing regulations and technical documents. Congress should clarify that any environmental impacts that are regulated or managed under another law do not require redundant analysis and evaluation under NEPA. We still get full coverage, but we eliminate the redundancy. Finally, new infrastructure faces a 5-year delay and a massive backlog preventing connection to the electricity grid. Imagine if that was your home, your school, or your hospital, 5 years before you can connect to the grid. Congress should set a 6-month limit on interconnection decisions and direct the FERC and DOE to work with system operators to implement automated technology solutions with 3 years. We have the hardware, we have the software, we just need to invest to make it happen. With these initiatives, brownfields can happen starting tomorrow, and we can move from thousands of sites redeveloped to hundreds of thousands of sites redeveloped, and it will be the foundation of the future of our economy. Thank you for your consideration, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, sir. Now recognize Mr. Bowledge. Mayor, for your 5-minute opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman Griffith. I appreciate it. Ranking Member Tomko, it's good to see you again, and thank you very much, Congressman Menendez and Congressman Pallone, for your kind words. I've been before this committee chairman numerous times since the 1990s on the topic of brownfields, and I represent the U.S. Conference of Mayors, but I'd like the committee to know that we're also working closely with the National League of Cities and the National Association of Counties on this important issue. I also want to thank this committee for incorporating our recommendations into the Brownfields law in 2018, including the multi-purpose grants, the increasing of the cleanup grant amounts, and we were very pleased at that time to see additional funding of $1.5 billion and higher funding caps that were included in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. Previous testimony, cities have been doing brownfields, as all of you know, for years, but we've hit roadblocks on those efforts, and the legislation that you mentioned in your opening remarks, Chairman, in 2002 was a game changer on many of those roadblocks. Providing liability protections for innocent parties, codified the Brownfields program, and made a difference throughout many communities in this entire country. The results are impressive. For every federal dollar that are awarded in this Brownfields program, $20.45 has been leveraged. 13.9 jobs were leveraged per $100,000 of EPA funding. The only downside, as you know, Mr. Chairman and members of this committee, are that the grant applications far outnumber the resources that are available. And although many of the easier to develop brownfield sites have been tackled, communities still struggle to develop more difficult sites. The changes that were incorporated in 2018 reauthorization bill, as well as the Jobs Act, have assisted with cleanup and redevelopment of more complex sites. EPA Brownfields has consistently been one of the most useful federal programs at the local level, and it's a bipartisan program supported by Congress. Brownfields are a neighborhood eyesore that the neighborhood sees, but for cities, they represent unutilized potential. We see redevelopment as a chance to create jobs, revitalize neighborhoods, increase the tax base, and reutilize existing infrastructure. I want to thank Congress for including $1.5 billion in Brownfield's redevelopment in the Job Act, as well as providing higher grant levels. EPA was hesitant towards larger grants because they only had $90 million. However, with the increased funding and additional flexibility, EPA provided larger grant amounts of $500,000 for assessments and $5 million for cleanups. In my community, we've developed the Jersey Gardens, the Harborfront Villas, Elizabethport Hope 6, and they're all included in my written testimony. The former landfill became a 200-acre shopping experience. A former industrial waterfront is new home to mixed-use development that includes luxury homes as well as affordable housing. This is what the the Brownfields program is all about. Each community is different. They have their own needs and their own vision, and the program provides them with the tools they need. Regarding the next reauthorization bill, we would like to recommend, on behalf of the Conference of Mayors, naturally additional levels of funding of $250 to $300 million per year for the next 5 years. Multi-purpose grant programs, increasing the grant amounts to $5 to $10 million. We would also ask the EPA to allow the broadest application of the area to cover these grants. Support of our original recommendation of increasing the cleanup grant cap to $1 million with the flexibility to go up to $10 million in certain instances. Raise the administrative caps to a higher level. This will help smaller communities. And finally, we'd like to work with you to develop recommendations on potential tools that can be implemented. The changes that Congress has made in the last reauthorization bill improved the program, and significantly the Jobs Act built on that progress. Our organizations are asking Congress for a simple reauthorization package with change in the effective dates, but if possible, we ask for additional resources, such as those that were allocated in the Jobs Act. This is a program that I think all of us are proud of, whatever side of the aisle, and I urge this committee for reauthorization. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this opportunity.
I thank the gentleman and now recognize Ms. Stoneham for a 5-minute opening statement.
Chairman Griffith, Ranking Member Tonko, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. As Chief Executive Officer and President of the Houston Land Bank, America's largest geographic land bank, our mission as a quasi-governmental nonprofit is to turn vacant, abandoned, and underutilized properties into thriving community assets. However, I also serve as a steering committee member for the National Brownfields Coalition and a board member for the Center for Community Progress, both organizations dedicated to ensuring that brownfields are opportunities for redevelopment and economic progress. As the energy capital of the world, Houston is on track to become the third largest city in the United States. Yet hundreds of brownfields and acres remain barriers to housing, jobs, and economic prosperity. But unlike many major cities, Houston has no zoning laws, meaning that industrial sites often sit directly next to homes, schools, and community centers. This creates health and safety risks, drives down property values, and makes redevelopment complicated, especially when absentee landlords, legal barriers, and contamination costs prevent private investment from stepping in. But that's where land banks step up. We take on the toughest properties, the ones that market won't touch, and position them for community-driven revitalization, but we can't do this work alone. One example of federal support and action is Project Yellow Cab, a 6.8-acre brownfield site in Houston's near North Side. Once a vital transportation hub, the former taxi headquarters quickly became an illegal landfill, a crime hotspot, and an environmental hazard. But since 2019, the Houston Land Bank has secured $5 million in local government grants for site acquisition, leveraged $7.3 million in ARPA funds to gain full site control with Harris County, demolished abandoned warehouses, and prepared the land for redevelopment. But most importantly, we partnered with the community to plan 40 affordable single-family homes and 120 affordable multifamily units. In addition, we secured over $200,000 to ensure these homes are energy efficient and disaster-ready, a critical need in Houston where storms and hurricanes are a constant threat. But Project Yellow Cap is just one example of a bigger need. To expand our impact, we also secured a $600,000 assessment grant for over 40 acres to conduct infrastructure analysis, facilitate reuse planning, and to engage community leaders, environmental experts, and policymakers to drive new funding and partnerships. Today, we're working with a $500,000 citywide Brownfield assessment grant and a $5 million cleanup grant to transform a 60-year abandoned trash incinerator site into a public green space. But without sustained federal investment, these projects and many like them may never happen. Land banks across the country rely on governmental partnerships to take on sites that private developers cannot do alone. But we need continued success in order to align with Congress to ensure long-term funding stability, expand eligibility for small community-driven projects, strengthen public-private partnerships, and expand reuse planning support. Because at Houston Land Bank, we don't see brownfields as problems. We see them as possibilities. Homes where families can build wealth, parks where children can play, and storefronts where businesses can grow. But this progress depends on sustained federal investment. Houston, like so many cities, cannot afford to lose a single square foot of opportunity. We have the tools, we have the partnerships, we have the momentum. Now we need the resources to amplify our mission. Thank you for your time and service and attention. I welcome any questions you may have.
I thank you so much and now recognize Mr. Miller for his 5-minute opening statement.
Good morning, Chairman Griffith, Vice Chairman Crenshaw, Ranking Member Tonko, and Ranking Member Pallone. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today on the critical role of EPA's Brownfields program in revitalizing rural coal communities. I represent voices from the communities of Southwest Virginia that have powered this nation for generations. Towns built around coal mines, processing plants, and industries that once thrived but have since faced economic downturn and environmental challenges. The Brownfields program is a lifeline for these communities. It transforms once contaminated, underutilized properties into productive sites for economic development, public use, and community restoration. The program does not just clean up land, it restores hope, attracts investment, and paves the way for a new economic future. One of the most significant benefits of the Brownfields program is its role in economic development. Rural coal-impacted communities often struggle to attract new businesses due to environmental concerns tied to former mining and industrial sites. Brownfields funding changes that equation. By assessing and remediating contamination, these sites, often the only developable flat acreage in a locality of very mountainous and sloped terrain, become viable locations for manufacturers, small businesses, and even a plethora of possible renewable energy and data center projects. We've seen direct results. For every federal dollar invested in Brownfields cleanup, communities see an average return of $20 in economic development activity. Also, it is estimated that Brownfields redevelopment creates over 10 jobs per $100,000 spent. Jobs that stay in the community and provide opportunities for displaced coal workers and younger generations alike. Beyond job creation, Brownfields funding enables rural communities to repurpose land for critical infrastructure projects. Many former coal-related sites are being transformed into modern industrial parks, and it is our hope future housing developments to meet growing community needs. Without this federal support, many of these sites would remain abandoned, limiting the region's ability to attract new residents, industry, and businesses. The Brownfields program is not just about industrial economic growth. It's also about promoting the resurgence of downtown communities. Many downtown districts, brownfield sites, contain legacy contaminants that pose risks. Brownfields funding allows localities to clean up these sites and create prime locations for downtown district resurgence, further improving the livability and quality of life in these communities. Many rural-dependent communities are seeking ways to diversify their economies while maintaining their identity. Brownfields funding is playing a critical role in repurposing former mine land and industrial sites for new energy data center development, including battery storage facilities and even small modular reactor possibilities to meet ever-growing domestic data center development power needs. I'm thankful for Chairman Griffith as well as Governor Youngkin for making SMR an energy generation priority in our region. Lennawisco, the agency I work for, completed an SMR site feasibility study and identified 7 possible sites. 6 of those 7 were brownfield locations. I also would note all 7 of those locations scored very high in the siting tool for advanced nuclear development, the STAND requirement. These projects align with federal and state goals for energy security while ensuring that rural areas remain key players in America's emerging data center and energy future. The EPA's Brownfield program is one of the most successful examples for federal investment sparking local revitalization. It empowers rural communities to turn environmental liabilities into economic assets. In my experience, when a former coal site is cleaned up and put back into productive use, it does more than remove contamination. It restores local pride, creates economic opportunity, and provides a pathway for the next generation to stay and thrive in their hometowns. I urge this committee to continue its support for the Brownfields program, ensuring that rural, coal-impacted communities have the resources needed to reclaim their land, rebuild their economies, and create a more sustainable future. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, and I thank all of our witnesses. We will now begin questioning by the members. I would ask that members remember not to ask a new question to our witnesses just as your 5 minutes is expiring. We do have, that happens. We do have the opportunity for you to submit written questions for the record subsequent to the hearing, and I would encourage you to do so. That being said, I will now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Miller, Dwayne, as you know, I represent a large district. It's larger than 9 states by landmass. And so while today we're focusing on Lennawisco and the southwest corner with the mines and so forth of the district, I have brownfields in all of the 28 different geopolitical subdivisions that I represent, from Martinsville to Pennington Gap and Lee County, which is part of your service area. And it's from those 2 locations, it's about 220 miles. No matter where you are in the district, to get from one side to the other, it's about 4 hours and so many minutes, depending on exactly where you're located. So I don't want to, it's not that we're ignoring them, it's just that I couldn't focus on everybody. But I am proud to have you here talking about the work that you have done in the Lennawisco area. Could you talk more about how your organization has successfully utilized the Brownfields Grant Program in our part of Virginia? And I know in your testimony you mentioned Project Intersection, so you may want to get into that. Mike.
Sure, Mr. Chairman. Yes, Project Intersection actually is on a brownfield site in the city of Norton in Virginia. As the chairman mentioned, I would say probably 80% of any acreage we have in the district where I work that is more than 5 to 10 acres is going to be some form of a brownfield site. If it's something that can't be developed, it's because of the slope or the mountainous terrain that's in the region where we are. Project Intersection was an abandoned mine land site, and we were able to develop those 200 acres into an industrial park just over the last 5 years, utilizing brownfield money for assessment in the early stages, and then able to turn those funds into AMLR funding through OSM.
And AMLR is Abandoned Mine Land Economic Revitalization. That's a separate program from your traditional abandoned mine land program, correct?
Correct.
All right.
And it's a wonderful program.
Yeah, thanks.
We've certainly utilized that program and secured over $30 million to develop that industrial park, and also have recruited 2 prospects that at full capacity will have 350 jobs within our region. 350 jobs may not sound like a whole lot to some of the members or members of the committee here, but 350 jobs in our region is what we like to refer to as a big lick. So we're really happy to be able to do that.
And you couldn't have done that without several programs, but particularly also Brownfield's program, is that correct?
Absolutely. There's really no development we can do, whether it's in downtown districts or larger economic development projects within our region, without reaching into the Brownfield pot in one form or another, whether it's in assessment or actual implementation.
All right. Can you tell us what barriers, if any, your organization has faced in receiving and making use of cleanup grants and revolving loan fund grants?
The biggest issue and what I would like to leave with you all today in terms of that is what can we do for redevelopment? The Brownfield money is wonderful for assessment. It's also wonderful for cleanup. But in rural small areas like where we are with an aging population and of course a dropping tax bases with that older demographic, is where can we find the funds for redevelopment? I mean, we struggle to find the funds just for the assessment, and what we've had to do is pull a lot of our localities together, go to EPA for a collaboration fund grant, and then use those funds because our communities, you remember some of our towns, I'm fortunate to work for 15 towns, 1 city, and 3 counties, and we have actually the smallest town in the Commonwealth of Virginia, Duffield, which has 50 residents. Going up to our largest town of those 15, which is about 3,500. So very rural, small area. So, you know, we will get, I kind of like, I won't use an analogy, but we really don't have the funds in our small localities to really get past. We'll do you know, the assessment, and then we'll get into the cleanup on implementation, but there's really nothing to go that next step in redevelopment. And I'm not asking for EPA and Brownfields to fund all of that, but maybe some type of matching program where you could access some of those funds in the form of a grant for redevelopment of some of those areas. And again, not 100% by any means, but at least something that we could do. And I'd be amiss if I didn't plug too. I certainly anything we could do that would help specifically coal-reliant communities, I think would be wonderful.
I appreciate that. And you mentioned Duffield, and I'm out of time, so I'll just say that Duffield has a lot of brownfield sites, even though it only is a town of, how many people did you say?
There's 50 in Duffield.
All right, I appreciate it.
It went from 54 to 50 in the last census.
I yield back. And now recognize Mr. Tonko, ranking member, for his 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses again. I absolutely want this program to be able to continue working effectively. And after the enactment of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, we have some new data points that Congress might want to consider for adjusting the program moving forward. So, Mayor Bolwich, do you and the local government groups you are representing believe that those IIJA funds have been used effectively?
When we can get them, yes.
And Ms. Stone, do you or any of the other witnesses share the view that the IIJA has resulted in federal dollars being well utilized?
Absolutely. It provided an opportunity to work directly with the communities to imagine what they would like to see and then directly implement the solution as well.
Okay. Anyone else on that? Those IIJ dollars included some tweaks to the program's requirements. Mayor Bolwich, I know you have made the point that many of the easier brownfields have already been addressed through the program, which has left sites that are more complex, costly, or otherwise less attractive for redevelopment. But of course, those sites also deserve the chance to spark a locally driven revitalization effort. Those IIJA dollars sought to address this by increasing the maximum award amount. So, Mr. Mayor, was this an effective policy change to better address more complex sites?
Yes, Mr. Vice Chairman, Ranking Member, it helps in a way that it affords flexibility for the municipalities, and that's the important part of that question.
Thank you. And did EPA strike the right balance between award amounts and the overall number of awards?
Depends on the municipality. It could work, the balance. In my city, it's always worked.
And do other witnesses have an opinion on the merits of larger award amounts? Mr. Conning.
Yeah, Ranking Member Tonko, the projects I'm focused on are these big innovation infrastructure projects which tend to be larger and have a much more complex physical infrastructure, but then have all these spillover effects into then the smaller brownfields that will support them and supply them. So think of building submarines in Mobile, Alabama. You have the big redevelopment that occurs just at the facility for building, but then you have all these zones around the shipyard that can now be restored and redeveloped. So it's a combination of anchor and then lots of smaller supporting, and now you can have a systematic redevelopment that brings lots of value to the community.
Thank you. The bipartisan Brownfields reauthorization that was recently marked up by the Senate EPW committee also included a statutory increase to the maximum award amount. And while the Senate hasn't gone as far as the IIJA's maximum awards, the inclusion of this provision is an acknowledgement that some future sites may require additional flexibility in the size of awards. Mayor Bowledge, based on the IIJ experience, is this a change we should consider in the program's reauthorization?
We believe the new money that's being provided by the Jobs Act is utilized and justify the appropriations in the future. Higher funding levels are naturally extremely important and could be included in this new authorization bill.
Thank you for that. And from our other witnesses, any comments on that effort being made?
I would have to agree, and anything we could do to raise the amount. And one of the things, again, I'm in a very rural location, so some of our projects may be as simple as redevelopment of an old school building. Not a high cost in terms of the grand scheme of things. But then we're also focusing now and really trying to take some of this rural property that's in a remote area and market it for data centers and also small modular reactors and looking at other energy projects. And as most of you all know, when you're talking about data centers or small modular reactors, you're talking about huge price tags. So anything we could do to increase, I think we would certainly ask.
Okay. Ms. Stoneham, I think you wanted to say something too?
Yes, the $5 million cleanup grant for the trash incinerator that I mentioned was the largest in our region. If we had more dollars, we could have considered additional uses outside of a green space, considering the site currently has over 40 feet of incinerator ash currently on that site. So if we had a larger funding amount, then maybe we can incorporate other community benefits, but we were very grateful to receive that grant award to produce that result.
Okay, with seconds remaining, I heard the chair earlier today, so with that, I'll yield back. How's that for being sport?
Absolutely. I thank the gentleman and now recognize Mr. Crenshaw for his 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Ms. Stoneham, for being here and telling us about some of these successful brownfield site cleanups in our hometown of Houston. Before I get to Mr. Connaughton on a few other questions, on some of these Houston-based projects, in your testimony you stated that the initial brownfield grant of, I think, $600,000 opened up $13 million. But when we look at those are also mostly EPA, well, mostly federal funding that it opened up. Where does the state come in projects like these? I saw some from City of Houston. What's the state agency that would be matching or cost sharing?
So currently, we have not had any match requirements or received any direct funds from the state. Now, we did coordinate with the TCEQ in terms of the compliance and the reporting and the testing, but we did not receive any funding as of yet.
Okay, I was just curious. Thank you. Mr. Connaughton, you mentioned many ways to make this just a more efficient process in general. Could you maybe elaborate on that and ways to increase private investment interest in brownfield sites and also the efficiency of the program and permitting and just getting it going? We keep hearing this stuff in terms of years. How do we make those months?
Yeah, so many of the projects that have been in the program are smaller, more located near cities, rebuilding communities, and this, we're talking about grants in the 1 to 10 million. What I want to talk about is the opposite of funding. Those are what I call assess to attract. So you're funding to clear the site, so hopefully somebody will develop it in the future. What I want to talk about is attract to assess, where there's not an outlay of money. The main obstacle to building out large innovation infrastructure, and I have lived it, and have the successes and the scars to prove it. The main obstacle is speed to project completion. So if I know I'm going to build a $200 million data center project, which I have done, and I know that I can actually turn it on in under 2 years, which is impossible, I'll pay anything to assess the site to make it clean for redevelopment. Okay, that'll be on my budget. But if I'm looking at a brownfield and I'm not sure of its assessment status, and I don't know I can get my permits, and I don't know what I can build, my project is going to cost 2 to 3 times more. Right? I'm going to have all this uncertainty, and I'm not going to get my investors or my insurers to sign off. So the biggest risk to brownfield redevelopment are all the projects that never get built that we don't talk about, okay? Because they die on the vine. That's why these permitting reforms are so vital. And I want to underline, I'm not talking about changing any environmental standards. I'm just talking about reversing the process step like we do in most other sectors, which is let's let developers with their third-party experts actually build and be subject to an enforcement for noncompliance, which, by the way, in the modern age almost never happens now. The rules are strict, the enforcement's harsh, you have huge damages, liabilities. So the beauty of rebuilding in a brownfield is you can take that brownfield and turn it into an environmental greenfield. And that's why you can support all these activities. But you need this, a three-legged stool, and the three-legged stool is you've got to get the site assessments cleared fast. Okay, I can pay my expert to do it in weeks, actually, months, but then I sit around and wait for 1.5 years for the government clearance, right? I can do all my NEPA. I did a NEPA in California. We did it in 3 months, and it took me 3.5 years to get it signed off on. I mean, that's nuts. And then the environmental permits, once I was finally able to apply for them, which I couldn't do till my NEPA was done, okay, that took another year. All right, my project is now 3 times more than it was. Very hard to, especially as a startup, to get investment. So if we don't go after all of these pieces, they run in parallel. Any one doesn't solve the problem.
Was this, when you testify about automatic sign-off processes, is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, we do that in so many other sectors, where we have third-party certified professionals signing off to government-set standards. And the Brownfield program, the mayor and others have created a 30-year record of how to do this right. We know how to do it. We have the practices. We have the standards. We know what's clean. We know it's not clean. The remediation methods are really well established. So where all of this is well established, we should just have a process where the professionals sign off, and then they can be inspected and reviewed, if they screw up. But it almost never happens anymore.
Got it. Thank you. That's an interesting thing for the committee to think about as we look at reauthorization. I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen, for yielding back. Now recognize Mr. Pallone, ranking member of the full committee, for his 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me go to Mayor Bolwich. In your testimony, you say, and I quote, "It will never be a bad investment to put more money into this program." Obviously, I agree. But as we start to think about reauthorizing brownfields, what authorization levels should we consider for the program?
Thank you, Mr. Pallone. I recommended in a testimony that we do $300 million per year for the next 5 years, and that the caps are set at $10 million for cleanup, multi-purpose, and job training grants. $500,000 for assessments is what's in my written testimony.
All right, thank you. And the bipartisan infrastructure law had $1.5 billion. That was a big boost to the program, and I don't want to slow down that momentum, because brownfield sites are getting harder to remediate and clean up. So I think the authorization levels need to reflect that, if you will. But let me go to Ms. Stoneham. From your perspective, how important is it for Congress to reauthorize the Brownfields program, and particularly for the planning of important projects that are in the pipeline?
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. So for the reuse planning aspect of brownfield assessment, that's one of the first lines of implementation, of just being able to have a feasibility study, to have the reuse planning, and then, of course, obviously doing the phase 1 and phase 2 testing. So having additional appropriations so we can figure out not just what the vision is, but do they also match the pro forma analysis of whatever development is trying to take place would be extremely helpful, so we can move forward with additional money needed for the capital stack as we are partnering with the public, nonprofit, and private sectors.
Did you want to add anything to that, Mayor, about the planning of projects in the pipeline and Brownfield?
I agree with my colleague over here. As you know, Congressman, and on both sides of me, when we did the Jersey Gardens Mall, getting the money and the reassessments under brownfields was relatively easy, then getting sign-off became much more difficult. And so I would only add that part to the answer to the question.
Okay. Obviously, to provide certainty for local and private sector investments, we have to ensure the program is reauthorized in a timely manner as well. I'm going to ask both of you, the mayor and Ms. Stoneham, the next question. Has the Trump administration's illegal funding freeze impacted the development and operation of your brownfields projects, and how so? I'll start with the mayor, if you will.
So we have a $500,000 grant under the Jobs Act for brownfields for job training, and it was held up 2 weeks ago or a month ago. We're waiting. We can't even get a hold of anybody to talk to them. And just recently, I was told on a train on the way here this morning that we would know an answer in the next 2 weeks. And that's a tough way to deal with a grant that you got. Now, keep in mind, the Groundworks Association in Elizabeth has put in a lot of upfront effort when it comes to dollars and training for this, and now they're being told you can't access the money.
Well, I first of all, let me say I learned a lot on the train back to New Jersey as well. But you see, this is the problem. We had the freeze. The court said you can't freeze the money. But what I find more and more is that even though in theory the Trump administration has recognized that they can't freeze this money, not just for brownfields, but for so many other things, that practically speaking, in many cases, this freeze continues only because there's nobody to send out the money, the portal doesn't work, whatever it happens to be. So let me ask Ms.
I would just add to you, Mr. Congressman, that if you don't answer the phone on the other end,
Yeah, I mean,
it's
that's
frozen.
the problem.
Yeah.
So you got 50, can I add, Ms. Stone, if you wanted to add to that, Ms. Stone?
Yes, so it significantly impacted our timeline planning of what we needed for the procurements for the cleanup grant for $5 million that I mentioned earlier. Definitely just having the risk of us being a nonprofit and this being a reimbursement grant. Don't feel comfortable even publishing it, not knowing if we'll have the opportunity to pay our contractors. So we needed to meet the compliance measures, obviously, of this particular grant, but we also have other people that we have to report out to, including the community, the local government. So definitely the instability makes it difficult in order for us to enact the development that we said we were going to do.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the chair of the full committee, Representative Guthrie, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks to all the witnesses for being here. Last year, Congress passed the ADVANCE Act, which required the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, or NRC, to modernize its efforts to develop domestic advanced nuclear energy. The ADVANCE Act included the Nuclear for Brownfield Sites Preparation Act, which directed the NRC to identify and report on regulations, guidance, or policy necessary to license and allow nuclear facilities at brownfield sites, as well as other sites with retired fossil fuel facilities. So, Mr. Connaughton, in your testimony, you discussed the need to, quote, deliver on the proving promise of brownfield-driven industrial innovation, unquote, which requires, quote, a significant modernization of governmental approval processes for site assessment, permitting, and interconnecting, end quote. So, Mr. Connaughton, could you discuss, in your view, what improvements to the Brownfields program could be made to deliver on that promise?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And let's start with nuclear. The key for nuclear is the stringent safety regulations that the NRC is entrusted to implement to be sure that these projects are built in the manner historically that's been proven to be quite safe for our communities and providing tons of zero-emission power. That is the critical path to making these projects work. If you think about the billions of dollars that go into these projects, environmental compliance is a necessity. And the work of certified professionals, lawyers, engineers, biologists, whatever, is conducted by the project proponent, okay, to the meeting so that they meet up the highest standards before they ever go to talk to a regulator. If we can have brownfield sites assessed and ready to go, and you have these new, more modular construction in particular, but also conventional, And we had a system where you actually built and submitted your paperwork demonstrating compliance. Okay, if we could just allow the project to get built, okay, we cut the cost by 2/3. And that's a direct pass-through to consumers. It lowers your cost of capital for investment. It means we can have 3 times more for the same price for our communities. Brownfields are great for that and in the appropriate NRC identified locations. The siting is critical. You still want to 100% defer to local concerns and interests on the siting process, but the permitting process and connecting to the grid, if we don't fix it, we're not going to get it.
Thank you, appreciate that. So, Mayor Ballwidge, as I said, I spent a lot of time in the New York-New Jersey border there, so it's a beautiful town that you have in a beautiful area. So I just want to say, so in your testimony, you note that, quote, additional tools may be necessary to convince owners of mothballed properties that it's safe to turn over or sell or redevelop those properties. Would you talk about what tools you suggest would be necessary or may be necessary?
Well, one of the tools that we have locally would be eminent domain in order to take the property, and that creates the liability issue on who's going to be responsible if the city takes it over. The other tools would be financial incentives in order to attract the developer, whether it be through local tax abatements or through other tax incentives. Tools that this committee or the Congress could give us would naturally be more dollars moving towards the redevelopment process.
Thank you. And then, so Mr. Connaughton, in your testimony, you asked rhetorically, shouldn't we be doing more to put brownfield sites back to work with your new deployment of modern, large-scale industrial innovations? Do you want to kind of expand on that? And then maybe also Mr. Mayor and Mr. Miller as well want to expand on that?
In the decades following World War II, we built this massive physical footprint for the massive industrialization that unfolded, and then we've basically, given most of it away to, overseas and moving into more of a services and small tech-based economy. Now we're paying the price for that, which is now we got to rebuild it all. And the brownfield footprint is there. It's efficient. It's got communities. It's got all the amenities. It's got the schools, the churches. So putting those communities back to work in the new modern form of infrastructure is an opportunity we have to go after.
Okay, thanks. And Mayor, I've had you answer questions. I'll just skip over it because I'm about out of Mr. Miller. Is that shouldn't we be doing more to put brownfields back to work for the more large-scale industrial? You want to expand on that in innovations?
No, absolutely. And Mr. Chairman, as I mentioned in my comments and kind of switching, but in terms of SMR feasibility site studies that we did in our region, we identified 7 possible sites. 6 of those 7 are in brownfield areas. Mm-hmm. And kind of to your point to some of the other committee members, I mentioned 6 of those 7 sites are all in brownfield sites, and all 7 sites scored above average on a nationwide average in the siting tool for advanced nuclear development or the STAND criteria that's utilized for that. So that kind of goes back to your point, about what we can do for new types of projects. Mm-hmm. And I'd love to talk to you more about this.
I look forward to it. Yeah, my time's expired, so I will look forward to following up with you. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize Ms. Schakowsky for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to ask questions just of Ms. Stoneham and Mr. Ball. Am I saying that right? Ballwork. My questions, of course, deal with this issue of the, what's going on in our communities. And it's so important that we have clean places for our children, for our community, for our merchants to have. And we know that in Illinois, 7 of the counties definitely have places that need to be cleaned up and have not been so far. But I wanted to raise the question that seems to defer the ability, or could defer the ability to clean up. And one of them an important one that we see right now is that there are monies that are being taken away right now, and that there's going to be less amount of money to be able to clean up these brownfields. And I'm just wondering how you see the problem that is going to be emerging when the money is not available to do the cleanup. And I mentioned the two people I'm hoping would answer that.
So definitely not having the funding we need, especially with Houston and the significant amount of brownfields throughout the city and across our nation, would have an economic decline. I strongly believe in public-private partnership, and it's just too much for a private investor to take on solely on their own, especially with all of the compliance measures that need to take place. And having those funds will ensure the stability to have contiguous change for the different developments needed across our nation, whether it's housing or green space or solar activity. Really just having that consistency is absolutely necessary, in addition to the staff needed to make sure that the paperwork and the compliance measures are moving forward accordingly as well.
Well, I really feel concerned that people who have been doing this work, that the money is shrinking, that it's been taken away through the Trump administration, and I am just concerned that who's going to be able to have the money if the people who are working on these projects are out of a job.
I strongly agree and echo your sentiments as well.
Well, we have to watch that. When there are dollars being taken away, because then, you know, we need to have all the resources that we have in our communities. We know in the Chicago area itself, this is a real problem. And I'm wondering if Mr., let me get the name right,
Bowl wage?
yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Congresswoman. Many communities are still going to do the easy ones. They're still going to do the ones that are simple and the brownfields. And, you know, Congress recognized this in 2018 in the reauthorization bill, raising the cleanup grants to $200,000 to $500,000 with the flexibility to go up to $650,000 based on the anticipated level of contamination. But in answer to your question, we also need people in the EPA to answer the phones.
Thank you so much. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Now recognize Mr. Latta for 5 minutes of questioning.
Well, thanks, Mr. Chairman, and thanks very much for our witnesses for being with us today. It's a very important topic. And if I could, Mr. Connaughton, if I could ask you, because I mentioned, I'm sorry, I had to step out for a couple of meetings, but you mentioned something that's kind of near and dear to everybody's heart, is that as we're watching what's happening today with data centers going up across the country, and there's a real question of, you know, where they're being placed, you know, and the amount of space that's needed for them. And I'd just like to get your opinion as to what do you see what we could be doing on brownfields and data centers, because this is absolutely a massive need that we're going to be having in this country, not just the massive amount of power we're going to have, but just the siting and some of the issues we have there.
Yeah, just to put things in perspective, if we were sitting here 10 years ago, a 5-megawatt data center would be big. And then very quickly, it was 20 megawatts. Just 2 years ago, 100 megawatts was a gigantic data center. We are involved, my former company where I worked with, Nautilus Technologies, we're involved in a project at a old coal-fired power plant that shut down in Portugal, 1.2 gigawatts, so 1,200 megawatts of power that that data center will use. And in America, you're seeing these 250, 500 megawatt projects that want to be built and can't find the places that they can build to get access to the power or the time to be able to build their own power in anything that represents, the demand. I describe this as we need to build at the speed of the need, and we've got too many obstacles to getting there. The thing I want to underline is these data centers are essential to our daily lives, and the beauty is they're out of sight, and they're in big warehouses, but they don't clutter our world. They don't clutter our world. Our world shows up like this. And so they're really, really valuable pieces of infrastructure. And then, of course, with the AI, they're going to be defining the industrial, the fourth industrial revolution. And America kind of owns that right now. We could give it up. Ireland, for example, has no process for siting any new data centers of any size. They just killed the goose that laid the golden egg. Ireland was a hub for information technology companies, and it's over in Ireland. I do not want to see that happen here. Okay, we have the ability in these brownfields to make these data centers happen.
The big problem is, if we look about what we always talk about in this committee, and hopefully we're going to get something done in this Congress, like on permitting, to be able to, get into these brownfields and say, you know what, it's safe to put these in. And so what do you see on the permitting side? What do we need to be doing on permitting to move things along, get things along faster? And I've never, this is the great thing about this committee, the broad jurisdiction we have, I've never heard anybody ever testify before saying that they're against our regulations. Just give us regulations that we can live with. But what do you see on the permitting side that we ought to be doing right now?
What's interesting about all the big infrastructure projects, data centers, semiconductors, by the way, even shipbuilding today, they actually don't have a big outward environmental footprint. There's a lot of things to comply with, okay, but all the methods of controlling to prevent environmental contamination are well known and are in place. And so if we could simply change the default to yes, with inspection and enforcement of non-compliance, which almost never occurs, that solves the problem. And you do it in site assessment, you do it in permitting, and you do it with interconnection. You have to create an automated system. We live in a modern age. When I got in my car this morning, I did not call the police to get permission to leave my home, promising I would comply. I'm certified, I have my license, I have my insurance, I'm trusted to comply, and if I don't comply, they come and get me. We should be doing the same for our infrastructure builders because they're really skilled and they spend, we're talking about billion-dollar projects, $10 billion projects. We're in a whole new world in America, putting in physical infrastructure again. We've got to match that opportunity.
In my last 45 seconds, let me ask this, because again, when you're talking about going to brownfields, especially when you're going to, let's say, coal-fired plants, what is the real, the difficulty for saying I'm going to go into that facility to put that data center in there where these plants want to be there, and I have about 28 seconds left?
State or federal environmental review process, which is 4 to 5 years, and a parallel or overlapping state and federal permitting process, which causes me to have to know that I can't build and complete anything in less than 8 or 10 years. There's some exceptions to that, by the way, and they're really good, like in Memphis. The big AI data center there was built in 6 months, with just 6 months they had a lot of support, 6 months of clearances. They've set the benchmark. We should be able to do this in a year. If Memphis can do it in a year, the rest of the country should be able to do it in a year.
Well, thank you very much. My time has expired, and I'll give the balance of my questions written to our witnesses. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize Dr. Ruiz for his 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today's topic is about the critical importance of the Brownfield program and its impact on communities across the country. As we all know, the Brownfield program provides funding and resources to clean up and redevelop contaminated sites, transforming them into safe, usable spaces that drive economic growth and environmental restoration. There is bipartisan consensus that the Brownfield program is essential for community revitalization. Cleaning up contaminated sites and transforming them into economic engines benefits everyone, businesses, workers, and families across America. The Environmental Protection Agency's Brownfields program is a proven solution by providing grants and resources to assess, clean up, and revitalize these sites. We can turn blighted, polluted lands into thriving community spaces, whether it's new housing, small businesses, or parks. And since the program's inception, it has helped create hundreds of thousands of jobs and leveraged billions in private investment nationwide. Mr. Boldwedge, could you share how does the Brownsville program contribute to local economies, particularly in terms of job creation and attracting private investment?
So we had a former landfill in the city of Elizabeth of almost 200 acres. We transformed that with an initial grant of assessment into a mall that's about 200 stores, 2 million square feet, 4 hotels on the waterfront, providing hundreds of jobs plus 5,000 construction jobs. That site generated $63,000 a year to the city of Elizabeth, and now with state incentives and others, it generates over $7 million a year to the city of Elizabeth.
That's incredible. In my district, we see firsthand the consequences of abandoned, contaminated properties, sites that once held promise, but have instead become environmental and economic burdens. And these brownfield sites, many of which are former industrial facilities, gas stations, or landfills, pose risks to public health, drive down property value, and limit economic development in already underserved communities. For example, in 2019, the city of Brawley facilitated the sale and redevelopment of the La Seca property, once an unusable, contaminated site, as you see in this photo, that sat vacant for years and was a hardship on the community. And thanks to the EPA's Brownfield remediation efforts, that property has been transformed into a thriving car repair shop that not only improves the area's appearance, but also provides good-paying jobs and brings economic activity to the district. So this is a perfect example of how strategic investment in brownfields cleanup leads to real, tangible benefits for our communities. Ms. Stoneham, how does brownfield redevelopment contribute to broader environmental and sustainability goals, such as reducing urban sprawl and promoting green infrastructure?
Absolutely. With the Project Yellow Cab case study that I mentioned earlier, just that being in the urban core and producing an urban typology for the single-family homes is providing an opportunity for people to live, work, and play. But also additionally, the trash incinerator site, which is transforming into a green space, connects to a bigger Bayou master plan of how affordable housing and just being able to walk on the bayou and the different environmental measures and preservation components that we are evaluating as well.
Thank you. You know, we must remember that this is also about community investment. Too often, historically underserved neighborhoods like those in my district face the greatest challenges from contamination and neglect. The EPA's Brownfields program helps revitalize these areas by driving redevelopment, creating jobs, and bringing much-needed economic opportunities to the communities that need them the most. Oh, wait, did I say bringing much-needed economic opportunities to the communities that need them the most? That's equity. That's equity. And rural communities, like those from my Republican colleagues on the other side, need these funds just as well. That's why we must continue supporting these programs. Investing in brownfield remediation is not just about cleaning up land. It's about building healthier communities, creating jobs, and ensuring that all Americans, no matter their zip code, have access to clean air, safe water, and economic opportunity. That's why I urge my colleagues to join me in strengthening and fully funding the Brownfields program and the EPA staff who make this program work so we can continue turning environmental liabilities into safe economic opportunities for families across the country. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for yielding back. I notice that we have a group of students who have joined us. This is the Environment Subcommittee of the Energy and Commerce Committee. We welcome you here today. We are discussing brownfields, and we have 4 experts from across the country who are giving us different ideas. We anticipate that this will occur, that we will reauthorize the Brownfields program, but perhaps with some suggestions that our witnesses have brought to our attention. With that, I now recognize Mr. Carter of Georgia for his 5 minutes of questions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank each of you for being here. And I'm glad the students are here, too. I hope you're learning a lot. I know I am, because brownfields are important. Brownfields, in fact, we got over 450,000 brownfields here in the United States, and every one of them represents a unique opportunity for us. And I hope that we take those opportunities, and certainly what we're discussing today is important. On this committee, Energy and Commerce, we talk a lot about energy needs. We know that we're going to need more energy in the future, and our growing energy needs. And we also talk about the need for more businesses. So we ought to be looking at brownfields as places where we can grow. My own state of Georgia has over 50 major data centers, and many of the brownfields have the potential to house future data centers, and for good reasons. And a lot of these sites have existing power delivery infrastructure, which is a common challenge for data centers. Mr. Conahan, let me ask you, Connaughton,
Perfect.
Connaughton, okay. Connaughton, your company specializes in creating data center-related technologies. I've visited many data centers, and they use a lot of energy, a whole lot of energy. Do you feel that brownfields represent an opportunity for building out more data centers in America?
Yeah, I certainly do, and I'll give you the example of my company Nautilus, where we have invented an approach to cool data centers the same way you cool a coal-fired power plant or an industrial processing facility. And that's taking naturally cold water, running through the data center, and returning it unchanged, just a little bit warmer, back to the water body it came from. That's how we do power plants, industrial facilities. It's how we cool ship engines. So imagine all of these old thermal power plants, these old manufacturing centers that already have that intake and discharge infrastructure. It's already been permitted in the past. The regulators know and understand what the dynamics of this are. They tend to be located close, by the way, to water treatment facilities and other big infrastructure, so the workforce is there, and the communities are familiar with and accept that kind of activity. So we could immediately be repurposing these old energy centers and these old manufacturing centers if we were able to deal with permitting. Okay, I went to a site.
So how is permitting holding you up? Tell me that.
So our technology results in a process that does not trigger any environmental controls or regulatory standards. And yet, in building that at a brownfield at the Port of Stockton, right, which is a community that really would benefit from this investment, and even though our state NEPA review, it's called CEQA, our state NEPA review, we got through it in 9 months because we had no impacts. We had no negative impacts. It still took us 3.5 years to get signed off on of the NEPA. We then had to wait.
3.5 years?
Yeah, and then we had to wait to file all our regular environmental permits till that process was done.
Okay.
Because the permitters don't want to get into their work until the NEPA's done. And then for them, remember, we had no environmental things, nothing to regulate. That still took a year for them to agree with us that there was nothing to regulate.
Okay.
And in one case, we still got additional requirements, even though it wasn't required by law. So that's the challenge. That's just one example. There are thousands of them out there.
All right, well, I want to get to two more things, and one of them, Mr. Miller, he just described an area that I think could help us. These brownfields are in rural areas just as well as urban areas. So this is an example where you could actually use the brownfields in rural areas as well, correct?
Correct. That's what we want to do. We actually, I guess we refer to it as a green room back earlier, we're talking and made sure we traded contact with one another to put focus on this. I mean, yes, rural areas should really be.
You got water supplies, you got everything that you need.
Right.
Good. So this sounds win-win.
One thing that we do lack in some of our rural areas is the power supply for those data centers. But yet again, brownfields are also very attractable to alternative types of energy, whether it's small modular reactors, micro, hydrogen, or any of those other types of forms that you could then, use those for behind-the-meter power to these data centers.
Okay. All right. The chairman's already warned us about asking questions with little time remaining. But I got to get to this because I represent the coast of Georgia, 2 major seaports, shipyards. Mr. Conahan, what about the infrastructure? Shipyard, how can we upgrade shipyard infrastructure and the importance of building new classes of vessels, much of which will take place on brownfield sites?
The locations are there. We just need to say yes to building, and we need to extend the Opportunity Zone law to these infrastructure locations to bring in and leverage, on a 9-to-1 or 20-to-1 basis, private sector capital.
Great, great. Good. Well, thank you all very much. This sounds like a win-win situation, something we should all be interested in. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for yielding back.
Yeah.
And I now yield for point of personal privilege to Mr. Tonko.
I see our former colleague, Congressman Butterfield, is in the audience, and faithful member in the House, and led a lot of good fights on the environment. So good to see you, Congressman, and always a pleasure to introduce you. Welcome.
Welcome, and we appreciate you being back. I now recognize Representative Peters for his 5 minutes of question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Connaughton, a lot of us have expressed concern about the delays in permitting for getting stuff built. We've worked really hard on clean energy, in particular on this committee, and even the Biden administration recognized that. Last year, they took some steps to expedite permitting under the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, for clean energy on disturbed, developed, or lower conflict areas. So we're all in this permit reform game. I wanted to ask you about something, a distinction you drew in your testimony about limiting the scope of NEPA review to unquantified impacts. Can you tell me what that means versus quantified? What is an example of that?
Yeah, so if you take the original NEPA law, so read it, second page, it says the agency shall consider unquantified impacts. Because in 1970, we didn't have this modern body of environmental law. So it was a good idea. Okay, and I'm a big defender of NEPA, by the way. I think NEPA is important. But over 50 years, we now have environmental laws covering everything, quantifying everything.
For example, the Clean
Air,
Water Act. So
water, endangered species,
Right.
dust. You name it, we have a law that covers it, and then state and local laws that do it on a fine-grained basis at the local level. And so all project developers have to comply with all of that, and they do. That's the great thing. We should be celebrating that. They do comply with it. And so this idea for NEPA is, I had a 160-page NEPA document I had to do for my first data center, and all it talked about was all the stuff the other agencies were going to regulate. But I couldn't get to them until I got through my CEQA process. And so this is my point. It's redundant.
So what's the unquantified impact in that case? So you have in other words, you have the Clean Water Act that says you can release a certain amount of pollution, but not over that amount without a permit. So we know that's covered. What is the unquantified impact you look at under NEPA?
So what would be left is actually uniquely local circumstances, like proximity to a school, what kind of traffic flows there will be. Right? There'll be a whole bunch of unregulated things that are of social and environmental interest and concern, and you want to capture that, which is what the idea originally was for NEPA and for the state versions of it. So you'll have I think you would have a much reduced NEPA document that would be highly relevant to what matters locally, while still getting all the work done through the regulatory process.
A lot of people on my side of the aisle express concern that would limit public input into these decisions. So give me an example of why that's not a concern for one of these quantified impacts you won't be analyzing under NEPA anymore.
So you would have a public comment related to the zoning of the site. So that's the first and most important place. So the community speaks about site suitability through zoning. And you got to preserve that, and that's good. If it's a federal project, federal lands, or the stuff that FERC cites, then you have a national process for that, in which there's extensive public provision for public engagement, and they can sue. So you also have the public being able to participate in lawsuits. So that'll occur. In the unquantified NEPA piece, the community will participate in the development of the unquantified analysis. So they'll have that. And then with respect to the regulations, there's 6, 7 layers of public participation in the original legislation, in the development of the regulation, in the development of the standards, in the permits that are provided for those activities. And then public participates in enforcement. You can have citizen enforcement, and they can participate in lawsuits.
So by a long shot, NEPA is not the only point of public impact, whether it's quantified or unquantified.
Well, arguably, it's actually the least important in terms of environmental compliance. It's the most important in terms of local suitability.
Right. A lot of folks have also suggested that we don't need to change the process. What we need to do is really staff up the agencies. I know the Biden administration led an effort to provide $1 billion to do that, and that may be under some question. Is that an answer in this case, or do we have to have process reforms?
No, we have a gross mismatch between the scale of what we need to get done and the number of officials we have to do it. And it's a gross mismatch. Right. And there's no addition of staff that will change that. Let me tell you why. Let's just assume it's 100,000 projects. It's more like 200,000. Let's assume it's 100,000 projects. That's 100,000 projects. Each project developer is hiring lawyers, environmental consultants, and engineers. Their banker is doing it too, and their insurance company is doing it too. Okay, so that's a lot of professionals per project, 9 at a minimum to sign off on the project. Then it goes to the federal, state, and local regulators, 5 to 25 permits, okay, times all the districts and states. Okay, so you end up with sort of thousands of offices involved in doing all this permitting, times 100,000 projects, each one of which then has another permit bundle for connecting to the grid and another permit bundle for doing digital connection. So that's several 100,000 requirements. That's millions of reviews. We're not built as a nation to handle what we now want.
Right.
As a matter of process.
Well, I'm out of time. I do appreciate all your work on permitting and helping us get back to building stuff again. And Mr. Chairman, thank you for the hearing. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize Representative Joyce for his 5 minutes of questioning.
First, I want to thank Chairman Griffith for holding today's hearing on EPA's Brownfields program and the witnesses for joining us. In Pennsylvania, we are proud of our industries, the coal, the steel, and allied industries that were mined and forged in our cities and in our towns. Sadly, many of these legacy industries have fallen on hard times and gone out of business, leaving behind land in need of environmental cleanup and communities with limited resources to invest in that necessary redevelopment. This is where EPA's Brownfields program has been useful to ensure that these are areas that are not left behind and economic development can occur. Across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, counties like Cambria and Blair have used brownfields to leverage public and private funding to create family-sustaining jobs. This program is a great example of how, instead of federal government getting in the way with burdensome regulations, it can work with local stakeholders to spur lasting redevelopment. I've seen how successful these efforts have been in my own hometown of Altoona, Pennsylvania, where a Brownfield grant helped encourage downtown redevelopment by jump-starting investment. In Johnstown, Brownfield's funds were used to build the Greater Johnstown High School. Another Brownfields grant in Johnstown redeveloped the Cambria Iron Works, repurposing older industrial buildings into an area that can attract visitors and residents while creating opportunities for new manufacturing jobs. In the last few years, 3 new Brownfields grants have been awarded in my district by the EPA. 2 are in western Pennsylvania in Cambria and Somerset counties, and 1 in central Pennsylvania that helps capitalize a $1 million Brownfields revolving fund that covers Mifflin, Perry, and Juniata counties. Across my district, I could go on and on about different success stories of local communities taking advantage of this program to bring their towns back to life. Mayor Bolwaj, in your written testimony, you discussed some of the benefits of the multi-purpose Brownfield grants created in 2018 reauthorization of the program. You also noted that it would be helpful for cities to be able to use the funding for wider areas. Are there any limitations on the funding that make it challenging to redevelop cities or maximize the value of these properties? And if so, do you have any recommendations on how the EPA could be more helpful for economic redevelopment?
Well, thank you, thank you, Congressman. The first thing is naturally resources and the maximum or the minimum amount of resources. We'd like to use the multi-purpose grants continue. We want to see it included in the reauthorization as well as the dollar amounts increase. We would also like to ask the EPA to allow for the broadest application of the area to be covered by this part of the grant.
Mr. Connaughton, similarly, do you have any suggestions for Congress or the EPA on how the current program could better facilitate a variety of uses on brownfield sites or allow the applicants to redevelop properties with unique aspects? And can you explain why all stakeholders need to have skin in the game?
Thank you. I think, as it mentioned previously, we have this opportunity to take the big old sites and convert them into big new sites. And in that instance, you're going to be able to leverage a lot of private sector capital, as long as you can, have them see the capital go into completing a project in a reasonable period of time. That's why the permitting reform is necessary. We have some great programs, like I mentioned, the Opportunity Zone Law, which is quite popular and doing well. The big complaint with opportunity zones is it's not going to build big infrastructure projects. Why? Because you have to put your money in 6 months, and a project has to be ready to go. And the problem is there aren't big infrastructure projects ready to go and then you need the site to be designated as an opportunity zone. I think a lot of governors did good designations, but didn't think about these big industrial locations or shipyards. So I really recommend doing another designation round under that law, and I think you'll bring forward hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars of new private sector money, and that's serious skin in the game, Congressman.
Mr. Miller, have you or others in your organization identified any limitations on acceptable uses of Brownfields funding or lack of flexibility with any of the funding streams with the federal Brownfields program?
Not necessarily with the funding streams, but as much dealing with issues with the complexity of the application process itself for smaller rural areas. And I mentioned in my opening comments, we've had to pull resources together with our localities, kind of with the approach stronger as a whole, weaker as pieces, and going in for those funds. Other items, strengthen provisions for rural distressed coal communities and what we could do, because again, those localities, I'm sure in your district as well, struggle for funds, not for any other reason than just because of their small size.
And I thank you for emphasizing the need in rural areas. That is indeed my district. Mr. Chairman, my time has expired. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman for yielding back, and now recognize Representative Barragan for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to our witnesses for being here. I appreciate the bipartisan support we have on this committee for the Brownfields program at the Environmental Protection Agency. However, the EPA's budget and the staff it needs to implement its programs are under attack from the Trump administration. President Trump and EPA Administrator Zeldin have talked about a 65% cut on the EPA's budget. This would gut the very programs that keep our air clean, our water safe, and our children healthy. This threatens every program at EPA, including the Brownfields program. And House Republicans have been silent on these cuts to EPA. Mr. Miller, would massive cuts to the EPA funding harm the Brownfields program and the work of your organizations? Yes or no?
It comes down to efficiency.
So you're telling me that if there's a 65% cut to EPA, that you don't think there could be an impact to the Brownfields program. Is that what you're saying?
I don't know.
Okay.
Until that reduction was
Thank you. The Honorable Connaughton, what is your thought? If there's a 65% cut to EPA budget, do you think?
They're cutting the funding for the Brownfields program, then it will have an impact on the Brownfields program. And that's why I'm trying to advocate we need to, in this budget environment and in this political environment, we should be looking at the funding sources and we should be looking at the leverage, because even with the current Brownfield funding, it doesn't come close to matching the opportunity that we have to achieve here. So I'd want to look at all of it.
So would it be safe for you to say there shouldn't be a single penny cut to the Brownfields program?
No.
That there should not be? Or no, you're not saying that?
I'm not saying that. I'm saying we need to take a look at the program to leverage the dollars to do even more, in which case it could justify increasing. And as we've been discussing today, there could be good reason to increase the money. If we're getting 20 times the benefit, that would be a good deal in my view.
Okay, thank you. Mayor Ballwidge, many Brownfield sites are in rural areas, low-income communities, and communities of color. How would funding cuts impact efforts to clean up contaminated land in disadvantaged communities?
I can only speak to what's going on in Elizabeth right now. We have a $500,000 grant for job training, and there's no one picking up the phone at EPA.
Ms. Stoneham, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yes. I would say that cutting staffing by 65% would significantly impact the Brownfields program in Houston. Just the regional coordination that we experience with them on a reoccurring basis, which is monthly and sometimes weekly, depending on the projects, would slow us down significantly in addition to the progress happening in the communities that we impact, which are majorly underserved and low income.
Great, thank you. Mayor Bolwich, as Congress discusses the reauthorization of the Brownfields program, are there any improvements or incentives you recommend to better direct grants to disadvantaged communities?
In my written testimony, I talk about the cleanup grants, and I also talk about the ability to access the dollars and to draw down the money as quickly as possible.
Okay, Ms. Stoneham, how do Brownfields grants leverage private sector investment? And what happens to those investments if federal funding disappears?
So having access to federal funding makes it easier to attract more private investment, especially with the land bank taking that on, saves the developer, frankly, time and money because we're willing to take on that responsibility as opposed to having them solely do this by themselves.
Thank you. The EPA Brownfields program is an important program for communities, even in my district, actually quite a bit in my district. In Carson, California, we received $1.8 million in grants to clean up a former oil refinery site so that the Los Angeles Sanitation can build a recycled water treatment facility on the property. This grant was made possible because of the increased Brownfields program funding in the infrastructure law, a law that Democrats fought for and passed, and that I will remind folks, not a single Republican that's currently on the Energy and Commerce Committee voted for. So as we fight back against devastating cuts to the EPA, I urge my Republican colleagues to speak up and to defend the good work that EPA does for all our communities. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Now recognize Representative Pfluger for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Connaughton, I want to talk to you about streamlining. But before I do that, I just want to give a shout out to Director Zeldin for the good work that he is doing to find the fraud, waste, and abuse in these slush funds that have gone to fund NGOs and other organizations. And I appreciate your answer there previously, on the fact that, no, we can still fund brownfield projects and look to more efficiently operate our government. And that's something that we're focused on. So in your testimony, you talked about approve, build, and comply, which I think offers a pretty intriguing solution. Can you expand on that concept and talk about the streamlining of permitting and other issues that will help us with this topic that we're talking about today?
Yeah, yes, Congressman. The concept is actually very well practiced, but in a small scale, under the banner of permit by rule. There are lots of examples where Congress has looked at a very specific issue and legislatively approved, the activity to go forward, while still requiring compliance. Again, it may be a controversial area, but the border wall is an example of that. Bipartisan legislation in 2006 provided for that, and it allows the Secretary of Homeland Security to certify construction and to waive permitting. Again, not compliance, but waive permitting. And each administration, President Obama, President Trump, and then President Biden, each of their Homeland Security directors used that authority. Recently, you had the Congress, for the sake of, I think, one semiconductor plant, and it was critical, legislatively waiving NEPA. Okay, now the plant is still complying with all the environmental laws. It's still subject to all that permitting. It's not subject to 5 years of waiting around for the environmental review to get done. They're just getting on with compliance. So that's happened in Congress. And at the administrative level, at the federal and state level, including in your state, and we have the Congressman from Pennsylvania, there's actually well-established procedures for automatic permitting, okay? And by Texas is the king of the states when it comes to that. And things move, investments happen.
Well, thank you. I may come back to you on the state and local coordination there. I want to go to Mr. Miller. When it comes to rural issues, obviously this is important to me. I represent a very rural district, but one that has a tremendous amount of energy, one that could benefit very, very greatly. But we see, more of an urge to show to do urban projects rather than rural. So maybe talk to me a little bit about some of the barriers that have impacted us in the rural community.
I'm a big believer in our rural areas. We have kind of view them as a blank canvas, and a lot of people, you know, at least in the Commonwealth of Virginia, in more urban areas, because of urban sprawl and, for instance, data centers and construction of them taking up a property that could be used for other things that those people think would be of more benefit. I think it's an amazing opportunity for rural areas for recruitment of data centers and to bring them to those rural areas. A lot of data centers prefer to be in an area that's kind of away, especially when you're talking about Department of Defense and in more sensitive type data centers. So I really think a concise effort should be put on the recruitment of data centers to rural areas. And even, you know, through this Brownfield funding, you know, maybe a set aside for data centers, preferably for rural data centers, but especially for rural or for data center type projects. I think that's the future. I mean, I think we all know that, and we have to have the power generation for those data centers, which again, Brownfields present an excellent opportunity for that, especially in rural areas.
So whether rural or urban, these projects are beneficial. They help us in a number of ways, but specifically on the rural areas, can you talk to us about maybe some of the challenges they face when it comes to not being able to match funds because we have small communities, or you know, how do they overcome that?
Well, and that's one of the items I mentioned, of course, with the EPA Brownfield Fund specifically. You know, we talked about more funding from a grant standpoint for redevelopment. Not necessarily, I think they do a wonderful job with the assessment, though I love this approve, build, comply method that's being discussed. But we just need to figure out a way to, we can utilize matching funds, but we need redevelopment funds from EPA. In rural areas, we're really good to have a certain pot of money, especially state money for some of this development, but you have to have those matching funds. So again, I mentioned it in my opening remarks, if we could create something maybe that, you know, with some of this Brownfield funding for rural areas, and it can even have a match requirement to that. I think everybody's fine with that because we can stack. That's what we all do, I think. It's what everybody does to make projects work, especially at the cost we're looking at for these type of projects.
Thank you. My time's expired. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize Mr. Auchincloss, Representative Auchincloss, for his 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Connaughton, I appreciate your proactive and prescriptive set of policy proposals for this, and I think it might help me to bring it to life to use a specific example with you. I represent Massachusetts. We have a lot of brownfield sites in Massachusetts, many of them prime spots for redevelopment. We also have a big shortage of housing in Massachusetts and challenges with local zoning and land use restrictions that make it hard to build the housing that we need. Imagine a circumstance where there was a major brownfield site, state-owned, or that the locality granted to the state, and the state came to you and said, we want to develop this. We want to really build a huge amount of housing on this site. We got a big shortage of housing, and because it's a brownfield, we can bypass local zoning. In the future that you are envisioning in your written testimony, talk me through like what that would look like, how you would advise them, and how you would stack private and public capital to make it happen.
So first, you need the zoning, okay? So as soon as it's clear this is for housing, okay, that's the first gate. So now you have the local suitability. Second gate, you got to do the assessment. Assessment is not expensive, and it doesn't take a lot of time, and people know how to do it now. I mean, these professionals are sitting here.
The EPA could pay for that, or you think the state would pay for that?
Well, actually, if I knew as the developer that I could actually get through the permitting process then,
Right.
and get the project up and running in under 2 years, I'll pay for the assessment.
Got it.
Okay, because I'm not at risk now.
Yep.
That's the key. If I'm a developer, I know that I'm only 1 in 20 is going to pay off. I can't do 20 assessments. But I'll pay for the one if I know I will actually be able to develop on it. That's the key to this process.
What do you mean by not at risk for it? I mean, that's true now, isn't it? That they're not at risk for it?
So what happens is I get the zoning, okay? I then wait for the assessment, and that takes longer than it should. And then when the assessment's done, then I go in and I still don't know if I'm going to get all of my other permits.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
That's the environmental permits. So I distinguish siting and assessment from permitting. I still don't know that somebody's not going to come in and shut me down, 2/3 of the way through my development 2.5 years later. That's the big problem. That's why it's the sites you don't see investors show up for that the ones you should be worried about.
Right.
Because investors will go where they can get the return on their investment fastest. And for data centers, that's certainly the case. If I can't get it up and running under a year, I'm not interested. Okay, and so that's the critical step.
And if the assessment came back as showing contaminants, again, in your ideal scenario, what happens next, provided that the developer and the state are still on board with wanting to develop housing?
Well, actually, these great professionals have put together, there's just a cookbook for that.
Yep.
And it's cookie cutter. Everyone knows what they need to do. They know what the thresholds are. They know how to do, whether you have to cap the site or do some soil removal, or put industrial, not housing. So you put the industrial on the lightly contaminated locations and the housing on the clean ones. So that process is now really they're great at it. And so my view is let the professionals do a good job. Let them do what they know how to do already.
And the friction that you identify in our current system is that there is not enough pre-approval of those professionals to just go out and do it?
Yeah, just go out and do it. And here's the issue. If you imagine that we actually have to do 20 to 100x, right? There's no growth of the professional government class to be able to keep up with all that requirement.
Right.
We need to let each government professional, I don't want to lose the government professionals. I just want them looking over 100 sites, right? And moving 100 sites along rather than focusing on one or two, right? And more important, I want them inspecting and enforcing against the bad guys who are rare, rather than have them focusing on the good guys who actually know what they're doing.
Mayor, did you want to speak to that?
I just want to reinforce his point. We had a old plastics factory, and we did the assessment with Brownfield dollars, and the assessment said you have to clean away 3 feet of the soil and remove that soil, and then you could put a Little League field there. If we didn't remove the 3 feet of soil, we'd have to put pavement there. So we chose to remove the 3 feet of soil, build 2 Little League fields, and actually we took the bad soil and brought it to the site that I described that was the mall, where we are preventing the leachate from going into what's called the Arthur Kill, the waterway there. So it was a win-win for everyone involved. But once the assessment was done and the plan is there, then you can leave it to the mayors or the economic development directors to follow up on the next process.
Yield back, thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize Representative Miller Meeks for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Chairman Griffith and Ranking Member Tonko, for holding this important hearing today. And I also want to thank our witnesses for testifying before this subcommittee. Iowa, like other states, has abandoned, idled, or underutilized industrial or commercial properties where real or perceived environmental contamination hinders redevelopment. The Brownfields program is essential to helping communities address these challenges, turning what were once underutilized and potentially hazardous sites into spaces for economic growth, environmental protection, and public health improvements. Mr. Connaughton, your testimony calls for leveraging private market forces and certified professionals to enhance the impact of government programs. How can the EPA better integrate private sector involvement into brownfield redevelopment efforts, and what role can private investment play in accelerating the cleanup and redevelopment of these sites?
When it comes to certified professionals, the analogy I like to use is taxes. So I don't go to my CPA and then tell them what I'm expecting to earn next year, and having the CPA evaluate it, and then go to the IRS and get the permission for me to earn the money before I'm allowed to pay my taxes. I earn the money, I talk to my CPA, the CPA assesses, what the taxes should be. I then send that to the IRS, okay? And then if I cheated or lied, they come after me. And so I see this the same way. We have this incredible class of private sector professionals now who are almost all of whom are certified to do the legal work, the biological work, the engineering work, to provide full assurance of environmental and public health and safety. Just like OSHA, by the way. OSHA doesn't give you permits. You build your plant, and OSHA comes in and inspects and enforces afterwards. So if we apply the same thing to the environmental regime, this is what can unleash speed. When you unleash speed, you unleash money, okay? If I've got $1 to spend and I can get that dollar back in a year, I'm gonna go there versus I have $1 to spend and I get 20 cents back in 5 years, Okay, it's just economics. And speed is everything. And if I'm going to put my money into a software company, and I'm going to see it in 2 years, and I know my same money in an infrastructure project is 7 or 8 years away, where's my money going to go? It's going to go to the software company.
Thank you, and you addressed permitting and approval, so I won't ask that question. Mr. Bolwaj, you mentioned in your testimony the use of multi-purpose grants and restrictive view of the EPA has taken of their use. In past hearing, witnesses have testified on the benefits of using this program to revitalize economic opportunity or construct affordable housing. Is flexibility a strength for the program, and can you explain how the restricted view EPA has regarding these grants has made it more difficult for communities with several brownfield properties?
Well, the multi-purpose grants, as you said, creates flexibility, and that's something we pushed for in the 2018 reauthorization, and we're extremely grateful for that. It also helps what some of the other witnesses were talking about with rural communities and those communities with a lot less population, and those grants, the multi-purpose grants, clearly gives a leg up to those communities.
Mr. Miller, you mentioned that for every federal dollar invested in brownfields cleanup, communities see an average return of $20 in economic activity. Can you elaborate on how these economic returns are measured, and are there specific success stories from southwestern Virginia or other rural areas that highlight the long-term economic benefits of the Brownfields program?
Absolutely. I mentioned, I believe earlier to a previous question, Project Intersection, which is in Norton, Virginia. We were able to, turn a small amount of brownfield funding into close to $35 million in investment to develop that industrial site. So that number is actually an EPA figure, and I would probably say, at least in the coal fields, it would be a whole lot higher in terms of what the return is that we receive.
Thank you. You also highlighted that the Brownfield redevelopment creates over 10 jobs per 100,000 spent. And how are these jobs being allocated, and what steps can be taken to ensure that displaced rural workers, to Representative Pfluger's comment, as well as younger generations in these communities, are able to access these opportunities?
And that's an issue we deal with. It's a nut we haven't cracked yet because of limited population of a working age. We will create new job opportunities. A lot of times people in their current position will move, as we all would, to a position with better compensation. So that is an issue we're dealing with. What we're hoping to see, and what we have started to notice to see in our rural area, especially after COVID, is we are finally seeing for the first time, though a small amount, at least some in-migration coming into our rural areas from more urban areas. And so we certainly, when those people do come to the area, we want to be able to have things in place that they can make a living and prosper.
Thank you. My time's expired. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Now recognize Mr. Menendez for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member. Mayor Bolage, as I mentioned earlier, I'm grateful for your national leadership on the Brownfields Task Force, as well as your work back home in Elizabeth. In your tenure as mayor, you have taken on the challenges posed by Elizabeth's industrial history head-on, and you serve as a national leader in advancing brownfield remediation. Mayor, can you share some examples of how the Brownfields program has supported Elizabeth's economic development and environmental well-being, especially those examples that you're most proud of?
Well, Congressman, thank you very much. Thank you for your kind comments as well. The one we're all familiar with that I testified here is the mills at Jersey Gardens, which I spoke about earlier, 200-acre landfill that's now has 2 million square feet of economic development with hotels and restaurants, as well as the 5,000 construction jobs. Another one is the Hope 6 program. In 1999, we took 2 outdated public housing projects and recreated them into new Hope 6 housing, not only some market rate housing, but also some mostly affordable housing. We're currently developing around the train station, which you visited not long ago, where we've taken a lot of vacant land and have developed housing, part of the working with the Brownfield Development Associate, New Jersey Brownfield Development. New Jersey Transit committed $70 million to a new train station. That has helped the economic development as well. Harborfront Villas was another project on the waterfront that's created market rate housing. So those are three of the projects, plus the Little League field that I just mentioned as well. And we developed some neighborhood gas stations now into small public uses.
So in short, it's fair to say that the Brownfields program has helped transform Elizabeth.
Well, it's created an awful lot of economic development as well as jobs and tax ratables.
I appreciate that because I want to talk about, in addition to all of the projects that you just mentioned, last year, Groundwork Elizabeth received a $500,000 job training grant from the Brownfields program to train 75 students and place 40 in environmental jobs. I think you've alluded to it earlier, but Mayor, can you provide an update on Groundwork Elizabeth's grant?
So the Groundwork Elizabeth grant would go towards, as you know, Congressman, we're a densely populated community. And we've worked diligently to identify resources in order to address brownfields and economic development. The mills at Jersey Gardens is one area, but getting into this specific issue, Groundwork Elizabeth has worked with the housing authority in our city. They've worked with other nonprofits. They've worked to develop job training for young people. This proposal generated almost $1 million award from the National Science Foundation for air quality monitoring walks that we're doing in partnership with Rutgers University. I say this, that not only is the Brownfields grant responsible for that, but it's generated money from Rutgers University and other areas in order to work on air pollution issues, being a hub of transportation where the city of Elizabeth sits in the state of New Jersey.
Yeah, absolutely. And Groundwork, and I appreciate you having me in with Senator Booker to speak with them directly about the work that they're doing. And with respect to that specific grant, my understanding is that it's currently being delayed, the funding that was appropriated, the $500,000. Is that accurate?
So actually, as I told Congressman Pallone earlier, I was on the train on the way here this morning at 6:40, and I was informed that the grant has been held up based on chaos.
Yeah, it's disappointing because it would have put students to work. It would have helped facilitate the remediation of New Jersey's brownfields, and it would have connected folks to good-paying jobs, which I think is such a bipartisan set of accomplishments that we could have been doing right now, but is held up because of President Trump's unconstitutional funding freeze, preventing congressionally authorized grants from reaching the communities that we all represent. And it's obviously disruptive to the things that we all want to make progress on. So, Mayor Bullock, just if I could ask you a yes or no question, in your experience, has EPA staff provide Elizabeth and other communities with valuable technical assistance related to brownfield remediation?
In my 33 years as the mayor, we've worked very closely with the EPA under Democratic and Republican administrations in order to benefit my community.
Yeah, I mean, the staff does an incredible job. We need to fund the EPA, make sure that we don't have staffing cuts so we can continue the incredible work that you've testified here today. Thank you for your leadership. It's a real privilege to call you a partner and a friend. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize Mr. Evans for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the ranking member and, of course, to our witnesses for taking the time today. My first question is actually to Ms. Stoneham. In a previous life, I was the code enforcement supervisor for a local municipality. And in that capacity, one of the biggest headaches that I had to deal with was either abandoned or defunct commercial or industrial properties within the city that attracted just a lot of, in local parlance, they were problem properties. We had one particular one where it became the de facto dumping ground for anybody that didn't want to pay to dispose of a sofa. And so in 1 week, we had 46 different sofas that were dumped behind this building that the city had to go pay to remove. And in your testimony, you mentioned that many of these properties that are either in the Brownfield program or potentially viable for that program are owned by absentee landlords or tangled in legal and financial complications that make redevelopment nearly impossible. And so that was something that I personally interacted with, trying to, again, police up these some of these abandoned properties. And so the first question to you is there any way in how the EPA administers the Brownfield program that we could address some of these obstacles to redevelopment for those properties where you have either an absentee landlord or it's tangled up in some sort of legal proceedings because it's a defunct company and potentially that property and that building is the most valuable asset that that entity still owns?
Thank you for acknowledging that statement and for your previous service. For that particular portion of my testimony, I was referring to one of the powers that land banks have, which makes us unique and special, which is clearing up some of those clouded title issues, some of the airship property issues, but also most of the time those properties are abandoned, tax delinquent, or non-tax generating properties that are also brownfields. So I'm not sure exactly if the EPA can get involved with that particular lane, but I was just sharing that the land bank makes us unique in being able to address additional powers outside of just the typical contamination or the assessment with the Brownfields program.
So the land banks do have some special play in spaces where you have a property that's tangled up in some of those issues?
Correct. Different land banks have different powers. Specifically in Texas, we have the ability to request foreclosed properties at any point in the process, and we're currently navigating that process with our county and our city leadership so we can help to intervene some of those problems in addition to the contamination potential issues as well.
Awesome, got it, thank you. Mr. Mayor, thank you for coming. Next question to you. You mentioned mothballed properties again. In our city, we call them problem properties. I'm just curious, can you speak to any barriers that you've seen between this program and then actually getting those boots on the ground resources to local governments?
First of all, I really appreciate your story, by the way, because I live that every day with staff members. So the mothball properties usually is dealing with absentee landlord and people aren't involved in the property, and that's probably the bigger struggle. The brownfields and the incentives, if we can get site control, we could move some of these mothball properties back to the tax rolls.
Thank you. And then, Mr. Miller, a question for you, kind of going off of that same vein, just the liability concerns that exist in these spaces. Can you talk about ways that we might be able to either reduce the liability or assuage some of the concerns for the landlords to be able to get additional properties into a program like this, to be able to revitalize for additional industry or commercial uses?
Sure. In our region, most of the brownfield development is at a much larger scale for economic development projects, but in our downtowns, and keep in mind, most of our towns are a population between 50 and 1,000. So small, and most of those towns maybe have one in the downtown district, one land or one person that owns a lot of that property. So what we've been able to do with that, though, is through assessment and then through the implementation of essentially tearing down a lot of the facilities and then creating an opportunity for them to rebuild a better structure.
And so that's intriguing to me. The district that I represent, my largest municipality, is almost 150,000 folks, and then I go down, same thing, to small municipalities that don't even have their own police department. So can you speak to specifically to anything that you've seen in that space with those smaller localities that's working for you?
People working together. Really, that's one of the things. A lot of times, especially in a rural area, people may be uncomfortable even with the word brownfield because they're not familiar with it. So really, essentially, people working together, the landowner, people in the position that you once found yourself in, some of the building officials, and everybody working together. And again,
Thank you.
That's probably a difference between a small rural area and a larger urban area.
Thank you. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Appreciate that. And now recognize Mr. Landsman for his 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for this hearing. Incredibly important. The Brownfield program has been a huge game changer for folks and communities back in Southwest Ohio. We've done so much redevelopment work with this program. And so I have three sets of questions as we're sort of wrapping up here. And we'll ask them across the board, answer them as you see fit. But one is a question about, as we look to reauthorize, what are the big changes? I've heard a few of them, but I'm curious if you had to, pick the top two or three. What are the top two or three big changes that you want us to focus on? Two, the state's role has come up. And I'm curious what that looks like
or what it should look like, and Mr. Miller in particular, when we have these communities that struggle to get the private investment. Is that a role for the state to play? I mean, am I jumping to the wrong conclusion? I'm just curious in terms of what role the state is or isn't playing, but should be playing. And then finally, we just can't not talk about the EPA stuff because it's a huge problem. If you just talk a little bit about the funding freeze and the cuts and how you would want us to approach this. You know, what you would like to see the United States Congress do as it relates to this program and the withholding of grants. So 3 questions. We'll start with the big changes, the role of the state, and then the EPA cuts and funding freezes.
The most important thing you can do is look at this opportunity at scale. The program has crept its way up to tens of thousands, but it's 100,000, hundreds of thousands opportunity. So I would work backwards from how do we get almost all of it redeveloped and put together a suite of programs of which the EPA piece is just one important, but just one aspect. Speed. So automatic permitting, however you come up with it, legislative, so we're not tied up in courts forever. The money will flood into these communities, believe me, because the sites are so great. And then for states, states are
I would
really
call it, just because I think this came up, presumptive permitting, which is that you get it and then, okay, sorry, keep going.
That's great. And then for states, as it turns out, states, by the way, do most of the permitting, including delegated programs, and states want this freedom because they know what they want to do. They're close to their communities. That's why Texas is so good at this, okay? And if it works, it works. And they still have really high levels.
Could you say that again? Texas is what?
Texas is so good at this, and they assure environmental compliance.
Yeah.
So, we should be competing with them.
Yeah.
Congressman, naturally, more money has got to be the top of the category. And, we talked about caps set at $10 million for cleanup and multi-purpose grants. One of our Congress members, Mikey Sherrill, has introduced a bill along with Mike Turner, who's in Ohio. Mike used to be a co-chair with me on the U.S. Conference of Mayors Brownfields Task Force way back when. And, they have a bipartisan tax incentive bill. That bill would be helpful along with reauthorization of this. It's called H.R. 815, allows companies to expense their cleanup costs in the year that it incurred. So those issues would be important and helpful. As far as the state goes, I've worked really well with the state of New Jersey, and I think that often depends on the relationship between mayors and governors.
And the freeze?
And the freeze, of course, yes.
I mean, is there something you want this Congress to do?
Well, I'm curious to know why, and I don't mean to be a smartass, but why are we spending 4 hours here if we're not going to have any funding and people to eventually execute what we're doing here?
It's a good question.
In terms of the changes, absolutely will echo more resources, but also could there be more flexibility for acquisition funds? We can't even use the assessment dollars or cleanup dollars if you don't have site control. So if there could be a line item to where you can also use dollars for acquisition would be a game changer. In terms of the state's role, Texas is awesome. But I also say if there could be a streamlined approach to make sure we're not working in silos, because depending on if you're talking to the TCEQ, the Texas Railroad Commission, it kind of just depends on which program is applicable. And then, of course, just making sure that we're able to access the technical experts to help us spend the dollars.
I'm out of time. And out of respect to the chair and the rest of the committee, I yield back. Sorry.
We'll get Dwayne's answer later when the Texas delegation is talking again. I now recognize Ms. Fedorchak for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Excellent. Well, good afternoon. I think it's afternoon now. Thank you all for your expertise. This is a fascinating subject, and I would love to spend 10 minutes talking to each of you about this, but we have a very limited time. So I'm really going to zero in on the AI issues here. I agree with Mr. Connaughton that AI could drive or power the fourth industrial revolution in our country. But in order to do that, we need to power AI, and meeting the energy demands of this business that is a substantial challenge for our country. That's why I launched an AI and energy working group this week and invite
you all to participate. We initiated an RFI seeking information, so I hope you all will participate in that. Mr. Connaughton, you have particularly piqued my interest with your thoughts on permitting reform. I spent 12 years permitting as an environmental permitter in my state, as a state utility commissioner, and so have a decent amount of experience in that. You mentioned this idea of certifying a third-party expert site assessments. That's brilliant. What's preventing this from happening more broadly?
What's preventing it is not accepting the fruits of their labor.
In law, federal law?
In
or-
law, because
Okay.
they do the work, they certify it, they're liable, professionally if they're cheating or lying like CPAs, and then we spend 5 years working to agree with them.
Okay.
So my view is let's put the private sector professionals that we've trained to work, and let's accept the fruits of their work.
Great. Love that. In my state, once an area has been permitted or certified to be safe for construction, you can rebuild in that same site without going through permitting again. So it's kind of the same type of
Could I
concept.
also mention, because you're a former regulator, when we have a major storm, the utilities are incredible at rebuilding as fast as humanly possible.
True.
It's the same process. It's the same people. They know what they're doing, they know how to comply, and we are so overjoyed when the electricity system is stood back up in 48 hours. If we want to build new infrastructure, 4 years, 5 years, 6
Right.
years. Why don't we take the example of our emergencies and make that standard practice?
And the same on your NEPA idea on the unquantified environmental impacts. So I'll be following up on those, and I'm sure many of my colleagues will be as well. I wanted to zero in a little bit more on your interconnection proposal, the 6-month window. That's the only area where I think you might be a little overly optimistic, having gone through a lot of that on the MISO level, the interconnection queues and the studies required. So talk a little bit more about what you envision there and how much your vision is tied to actual experience trying to go through those interconnection processes.
So having suffered through this, wearing many different hats over 35 years, there's only a technological solution to the interconnection problem. So we have to get on with applying the AI and the hardware systems, and the RTOs currently aren't funded, and their business model isn't set up to do it that way. So I really believe that is the only way through this, and our target has to be 6 months, because we have to build at the need of speed.
So using AI to help them run their studies faster when they're
Yeah, because they're operating 12, 15, 16 different spreadsheet models. And it was one thing when you're like, attaching dozens or hundreds of projects. We're going to be attaching thousands or tens of thousands of projects. Just the labor of doing that, we can't keep up. The technology is going to solve our problem, but we're 10 years behind in applying it.
And have you talked to any of the grid?
Yes.
Any of them? Which ones are open to this?
Stay tuned for an interesting announcement that's coming. I can't say anything further on that.
Okay, very good. Then, just with my remaining 1 minute, I would like you and others, if they have time, to elaborate on what else should we be doing to stay ahead? Because I'm really worried that we're going to be falling behind China on our ability to really meet the energy demands of this industry. So, Mr. Connaughton, if you could start.
Really focus on the communities that actually want to build. So let's put a priority where people actually want to do something. We spend a lot of time trying to work in areas where people just don't want to see the construction. So I'd start there, start with yes, and create a competition for outcomes rather than work with all the problem children.
Okay. 20 seconds, anybody else?
Dwayne Miller wants to say he'll take all those places.
You actually read my mind. Any rural area with specific interest in Southwest Virginia. Yeah,
And North Dakota.
yeah, yes, ma'am.
All right, thank you, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Now recognize Mr. Carter for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of our witnesses for being here today. The EPA Brownfield program revitalizes communities by transforming contaminated properties into economic assets. It attracts private investment, creates jobs, and boosts local tax revenues through funding and technical assistance for the assessment, cleanup, and redevelopment of potentially contaminated former commercial industrial sites. This transformation eliminates environmental hazards and stimulates economic activity, benefiting businesses and residents. This is critically important
A prime example of this type of development is the recent $2 million award of an EPA Brownsfield Cleanup Program grant for the city of New Orleans to support the environmental remediation of the former Naval Support Activity Complex in the downtown Bywater neighborhood. This vast, now vacant complex, completed in 1919 by the United States Navy, formerly served as logistics station for the Port of New Orleans and the military training site. Deactivated and sold to the city of New Orleans in 2011 for redevelopment, it comprises some 84,000 square foot, 6-story buildings on about 1.5 million square foot site. Thanks in large to EPA Brownfield funding, the complex is now being redeveloped to create mixed-use development with 295 affordable residential units and ground floor retail space, including a grocery store and as the primary retailer. Ms. Stoneham, since taking office, President Trump has pledged to cut funding to EPA by 65%, undertaking significant indiscriminate staff firings and terminated congressionally appropriated EPA grant funding to local recipients. Can you tell us how the current atmosphere of the uncertainty impacts the EPA Brownfield programs, awards, and projects now underway in your home of Houston?
Absolutely. It has significantly impacted our project timeline and us being able to release procurement opportunities. It also reduces the potential for more training opportunities, not just for my staff and the contractors that we work with, but also community members who directly want to better understand how they can receive access to funding allocations and just being able to see how they can amplify what they want to directly do in their neighborhoods. And then just the relationships that we built of working with our grant officer, the chemist that we talk to that reviews the reports on a regular basis, just so we can continue the work that we're doing and also continue to pursue more funding opportunities.
Mayor Bowledge, I began my career in local government, serving on the New Orleans City Council many years ago. So I understand and appreciate the incredible job that you have to do as a mayor and your employees do with limited resources. What would gutting our career workforce at EPA, including those at the Brownfield program who provide technical assistance, mean to your municipal employees in the city of Elizabeth who partner with EPA to carry out these projects?
So we're a very urban, dense community, and taking the EPA away from our city, which has the largest port on the East Coast, the second largest in the country, air pollution issues, brownfield issues, economic development issues. Without having the EPA as a partner, we run the risk of higher pollution and less availability of vacant land to develop.
Ms. Stoneham, without EPA Brownfield's program, would the projects listed in your testimony still be vacant, blighted eyesores in our community?
Absolutely. The trash incinerator site was abandoned for 60 years, and I strongly believe it would continue to still be abandoned and wouldn't have a partner to step up to take on the complex measure of having over 40 feet of trash incinerator site currently still there.
Mr. Mayor Bowledge, in your opinion, should we keep the funding of EPA Brownsfield in its current level? And without it, what happens in your communities?
Well, I'm always looking for more.
So cutting it is a non-starter.
Should not be an option.
Would you agree that it's counterproductive in that we actually lose money and not gain money by making these kind of ill-thought cuts?
Well, you heard testimony from Mr. Miller earlier that every dollar of the Brownfields generates $20 in additional funding.
So that doesn't sound very efficient. And if we're talking about an effort from DOGE to be more efficient, to cut waste, fraud, and abuse, if you're putting in $1, but you're getting 20 back, that seems pretty efficient to me.
It's extremely efficient for local governments because we have the ability not only to generate tax revenue, but also jobs, which then creates more income tax, et cetera.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. My time has exceeded. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize the gentleman from Texas for his 5 minutes of questions.
About time.
Okay, so we're gonna have fun here. So, how many sites, total sites in the country? We'll start down here on the left. Is it, say,
Connaughton, thank you.
Connaughton, I can do this. How many sites in the United States would you say there are Brownfields?
More than 400,000.
400,000. Would you agree, Mr. Connaughton, that when we've got almost a $37 trillion deficit, that we ought to be focused on reducing that in as many ways as possible?
Addressing the deficit's one of the most, along with national security, the two most important priorities for America, in my personal view.
Would you agree with that, Mayor?
You know, in a way, yes, but we recycle everything else. We need to start recycling our land.
Ms. Stoner, would you agree?
Yes.
We need to work on it, Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Okay. So the average, looking at sites, and y'all may know the answer to this question or not. What is do we know the acreage of every single site? Do we have that in our database? The size of the site, of the Brownfield site?
If I may, Congressman, I believe the local governments and the state governments would have that information.
Right.
I'm not aware of a national database.
Sure. Well, Texas Commission on Environmental Quality says there's 207 Brownfield sites in Texas. In my home district along the Gulf Coast, we have 10 sites. So the EPA is working with getting the word out. So, Mr. Connaughton, I think you talked about businesses being willing to get in there and redo this as quickly as possible if we can get the permitting process low. Does the EPA send out regular emails, letters? How do they get the word out to potential businesses? Mr. Connaughton, I'll come back to you if you know that, about there is a possible, business to be done here.
I think the answer is there's hundreds of different ways all of this gets communicated, federal, state, and locally, and it's a hodgepodge, but it is now coalescing into this understanding of 400,000 sites at different points, and maybe to get a jump on your point, which is we can and should sustain the EPA contribution to this effort, but I want to see all 400,000 addressed.
Yeah, but we have to do them in order of ones that yield the most economic benefit.
Exactly.
Do we do that? Mayor, has that been your experience?
In my experience, yes, Congressman. I mean, the landfill was causing health issues in our community. And not only did we take away the health issue, we generated economic development through jobs as well as open space.
And you see that in Houston, Ms. Stone. I grew up in Houston, lived in a 20-mile radius, 71 years. September 23, I brought this up in the last hearing on Brownfields. I would be remiss if I don't bring it up again. The cleanup site on the site that Dakin Park, formerly known as Minute Maid, right? Minute Maid Park now sits on the home of the Astros as a success story. Not every Brownfield site will be lucky at something like that, but would you hazard a guess, or how long have you been doing this? Let me ask you that, Ms. Stone.
I've been president for 3 years. Formerly, I was a board member, so I've been in this industry for about 15.
So what was the impact of the redevelopment of that for the Houston, town of Houston? Do you have those figures when they went?
I don't necessarily have the numbers, but I'm happy to follow up with that. But I will say just the resurgence of downtown with significant developments such as the former Minute Maid Park has created more housing opportunities, job opportunities, and just overall commercial redevelopment.
I'm going to assume, and Mr. Miller, I think you said something earlier about maybe it being pride areas for nuclear in some instances in your comments, or did I miss that?
No, that's correct. We actually, as I mentioned, we identified 7 sites in our region. 6 of the 7 were brownfields, and all 7 scored very highly in the industry standard.
Now, that's in your Commonwealth of Virginia, correct?
That's just within Southwest Virginia.
Southwest Virginia, okay. Is there a rating, I'm sure there is, of severity of these sites? Some that have, are you familiar with the Brio site, Ms. Stoneham, in south part of Houston, over toward Dixie Farm, south of Hobby Airport, about 10 miles? It's been a long time since it was an issue.
I am not familiar with that specific
Yeah,
site.
probably predated you, but the severity, okay. Well, good enough. I'll leave it there, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much for yielding back. Now recognize Mr. Soto for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses. I know it's been a long day. You're almost through it. You know, we're here talking about brownfields, polluted lands that we see throughout all of our districts, even in Florida, where a lot of the areas in Central Florida are very new. We see that brownfields are bad for public health. They're bad for business. They're bad for communities. When you look at places like downtown Kissimmee or downtown Orlando, you'll see gas stations that were around 10, 20 years ago, and now it's just sitting there abandoned in the middle of downtown. These are areas that, when they're restored, bring huge economic growth to areas. I'm thrilled that through the infrastructure law, we saw over $1 billion in investment in these brownfields programs. When you look at Florida itself, in Florida's 9th Congressional District, we have 45 sites in Orange County, where Orlando is, one of the most urban areas of our district, 4 in Osceola and 31 in Polk County, a lot of old citrus sites and helping out with mining in that area. And then since 1997, we've seen in Florida over 235 contaminated sites cleaned up in Florida, almost 90,000 jobs. So we know that this can be helpful. So which is when I saw the 65% cut to EPA spending, I was deeply concerned about that. Now it looks like it won't be staff alone, it'll be spending cuts, and obviously we want to be mindful that this isn't strategic and it could hurt programs like the Brownfield. Mayor Bullwage, how could a reduction in 65% spending or a huge reduction in staff affect brownfield projects that you're working on?
Well, if it happens all at once, it'll create chaos, and that seems to be what's going on at the moment. I would not like, as a mayor of the 4th largest city in New Jersey, not be able to rely on EPA and EPA funding.
You know, a long time ago, I lived in New Jersey and worked in Jersey City.
Where? Oh, Jersey City?
At the Lackawanna building in Jersey City, and then for Prudential, and I saw the important reuse through these brownfield programs. Like many New Jerseyans, I'm a Floridian for over half a lifetime now, and work very closely with our ranking member, Frank Pallone, and others. And we see this in Central Florida, in areas that, even though they may be a little newer, they're still already brownfields, and it's just leaving economic growth on the table. Do you think this would affect the number of years it takes to put these projects forward?
Absolutely. I mean, you've heard an awful lot of testimony from Mr. Contaminated about the process. And if you eliminate the people who are reviewing the process, then the mathematical equation is it takes even that much longer.
And then how important is consistency in getting investment and raising bonds to help match some of these funds?
Well, being the 4th largest city, unlike the rural and the small towns, we have the ability to raise money through bonding issues. And that is helpful in redeveloping a brownfield site. But if you don't have the people to review it and you don't have the assessments done properly, then it takes that much longer. And the bonding agency is going to give you a more difficult rate to borrow that money.
Mr. Connaughton, I did appreciate your comments about the need to try to streamline these. So I'm trying to find, what is that careful balance to have an efficient review where it's not dragging on and on and on, but we're not just rubber stamping even a well-qualified private sector's plan without at least some review. So where do we find that balance with something so sensitive as brownfields?
Well, the great advantage of the way we've constructed our modern environmental laws is they all have reporting, monitoring, self-reporting of noncompliance, auditing, inspection, and enforcement. And very different from when I started in my career, and many of you, we now have a culture of compliance when it comes to the environment. In fact, so noncompliance is very rare, and especially with respect to the kinds of big infrastructure projects that I've been talking about. Okay, they can't afford not to comply. So my view is, can we please let them? And they still have to do all the mandatory things with the judicial review behind that and citizen suits. So there's still risk if you screw up. We're just putting 99% of our effort on the people that don't screw up. And this goes to the resources issue you're raising. I really want to see our quite capable environmental professionals that are in these agencies. I want them working on the hard problems. I don't want them working on the easy problems. So I think we can find a really good outcome here. But also, I would just note, we have 400,000 to work on, and there's no amount of increase in the Brownfields budget, which, again, I want money there, but there's no amount of increase that's going to get the rest of the 40,000. We've only done, tens of thousands in 25 years. So I want to be sure that, I hope you will look bigger and say, let's go after all of them because we need them, of which EPA is one contributing part.
Which is why we need to keep EPA funding steady to keep these projects going. Thanks so much, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I'm going to take a point of personal privilege since he mentioned Osceola and Orlando. My constituent who lives not too far from Mr. Miller is Mac McClung, who plays for a two-way contract with the Orlando Magic and the Osceola Magic and is a three-peat winner of the dunk contest. And
Mr. Chairman?
Both Mr. Miller and I know his family, and we wish him well.
If I may, I saw him jump over Shaq to dunk last year to win the championship. We're going to claim him partially, if that's okay with you, sir, since he does play
we
for
will
the
share.
Osceola
We just
Magic.
want to make sure the Orlando Magic pick him up full time. And that being said,
I support that. We'll get the petitions going. We're doing it right here in the Energy and Commerce Committee.
there you go. That being said, we have the policy in our committee of anyone who is on the committee being able to waive on. Ms. Dingle considers this an important matter and has sat here for some time so that she can waive on to the committee. We welcome her and now recognize Ms. Dingle for her 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for letting me be here and for this important hearing on EPA's Brownfield programs. And thank you to all of the witnesses. I know that I've been content for a long time. We've worked together on things. We agree most of the time. And it's great to be with all the witnesses. As we've heard today, the Brownfield programs have a long history of empowering states, local communities, and stakeholders to work together to clean up contaminated sites, protect public health, and restore land for productive use. It has enjoyed strong bipartisan support in this committee, and I am hopeful that it'll continue in this Congress. In my district and across Southeast Michigan, the Downriver Community Conference operates one of the most successful programs in the country, as Jim knows. Serving 20 communities across 3 counties and over 900,000 residents, the DCC has secured and distributed more than $21 million in grants for site cleanups and their assessments. It's revitalized 200 sites, generating more than $700 million in investment, creating jobs, and strengthening the tax base of our downriver communities. Through the Brownfield programs, the DCC has made Michigan a more vibrant, sustainable, and attractive place to live, work, visit, and raise a family, and we need to make sure this success continues. We must reauthorize and fully fund the program, and if you think people don't care, it continues to be an issue that brings many people that to town hall meetings every quarter that I hold that want. We're a heavy industrial area. We have a lot of places that need to be cleaned up. So the Brownfield programs delivers real results, and we must ensure it remains a priority. Mayor Balazs, a lot of people have asked you the same questions I was going to, so I'm going to ask you the same question, but a different way. If the Brownfields programs, it's set to become insolvent in 2026, what will be the impact on your community if these resources are allowed to last?
So we have identified 57 brownfield properties, of which we've developed about 15 to 18 properties. Without the ability to have assessment dollars or cleanup dollars, then our efforts to revitalize that property would be put off for another day or years.
Or may not get cleaned up.
Ever.
And when we are revitalizing a community through Brownfields programs, it's imperative that we center said community in the planning and implementation process, assuring that we are serving their needs first and foremost. Ms. Stoneham, you emphasized that a key part of redevelopment is ensuring to that end of product it's reflective of the priorities for your community. Can you talk more about how you accomplished this when you were administrating your Brownfield grants in Houston?
Happy to. We have a Brownfields Activation Committee, which is comprised of local community leaders, policy experts, professionals, and anyone who just cares, whether you're doing air quality, soil quality, water quality. We convene them on a quarterly basis in order to discuss our projects and to directly listen to what they would like to see. But we also host community visioning sessions with our architects so we can discuss what housing solutions can be placed, whether it's a duplex, a townhome, or whatever typology that may be. We also incorporated in the Houston Land Bank policy a neighborhood advisory council. So regardless if it's a brownfield or not, they have a scoring portion of our criteria. So when we procure land and give it to a builder, we actually gave them 15 out of the 50 points.
Thank you. You know, what's important, I'm going to say this to all of you, is to remember that brownfield sites usually consist of multiple hazards that pose threats to the public health of their local communities. They're aware of it, they're scared of it, and that's the issue that drives a lot of this wanting to be cleaned up. Revitalization of brownfield field does not only mean an economic recovery, but the removal of threats that will contribute to the protection of our people's health. Ms. Stoneham, during your testimony, you mentioned that significant threats that brownfield sites present to the communities you work with in Houston. Can you speak more to the specific health challenges you've tackled through your work with the Houston Land Bank?
Sure, and I also want to share a saying that I've adopted from one of my colleagues from ADAPTA, which is everything is a brownfield until proven not guilty. And we take that approach to everything that we look at when we're assessing the opportunities. Now, I'm not an environmental scientist, but I will say for our Project Yellow Cab, we removed about 20 feet of soil, some underground storage tanks. We found levels of dioxin and just made sure that we're very transparent also with the findings that we found and publicly share that on our website. So we're also educating the community about what a brownfield is, what these contaminants are, and they can directly talk to our consultants so they can better understand what solutions we're proposing to move forward with them.
Thank you. I must yield back.
I thank the gentlelady for yielding back. Seeing no further witnesses, I ask unanimous consent to insert in the record the documents included in the staff hearing documents list. Without objection, so ordered. I remind members that they have 10 business days to submit questions for the record. I'm already thinking of some, and I ask the witnesses to respond to those questions promptly without objection. Committee is adjourned.